Welcome back. The good news is that if you're not worried by what you've seen in the documentary, you will be worried after you hear the next couple of panels. Because we've heard all these things about how social media manipulate data, how social media, based on their ability to predict how you'll respond, they can actually affect the kind of responses they want, which is to say, as was made in the documentary, they can change you. And that's a scary thought. So we're going to dig down now into what we saw in the documentary about how does it all work. Now we know a little bit what we mean by artificial intelligence. Now that's sort of looming there. But now, how does artificial intelligence get operationalized, let's say? How does it interact with the internet? What's big data and how is that collected? What we've heard this word algorithms, and it's got something to do with implications. So we got to know what these algorithms are and how that plays into social media. So we have four wonderful panelists for this afternoon's program. I will introduce them each, but the first one will be a leading figure in artificial intelligence and technology and so forth. Then we have a historian, a scholar to contextualize. We have an attorney to talk about the danger of cyber piracy and all these kind of things. And we're going to hear from my friend here, Rabbi Schochet, about what does the Torah say about our right to privacy. And that's a hot phrase in America these days, but we assume we have privacy, yet social media are full square attacking that privacy in ways in which we're unaware, which is what makes them effective. So that's what we're going to do. So that's a lot of ambitious ideas, and let us begin with Dr. Samuel Lightstone. Sam used to be the Chief Technology Officer for Artificial Intelligence at IBM. And before that, he was the Chief Technology Officer at IBM for data, focusing on database, and here's that word, big data portfolio. He can tell you what that really means. He's got more than 65 patents. He's authored 4 books, many papers, been translated to Chinese, Japanese, and Spanish. And he currently works in social media in a very senior position, but I can say no more. And he is also an avid guitar player and fencer. So please welcome, I can't have a big round of applause, but please welcome Dr. Samuel Lightstone.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thank you for the warm introduction. So let's jump into it. I'd like to give you guys a bit more background about what AI and big data really are, and talk about some of the challenges I think that they pose, and also opportunities that they present for the Jewish community. So this is basically the structure of what I'll cover: the problems big data and AI create for Jewish life, a little bit about big data and AI, state of the art, and some reflections on those problems and opportunities. As I was preparing today, for today, I spent some time, I reached out to a number of rabbis in my community. I live in Toronto, Canada. Reached out to a number of rabbinic figures in the community that I know, and I asked them for their opinions on the challenges that technology presents that they see. And they gave me their long list, a very long list. And I pruned down that list to the set of things that they said that I think big data and AI have some relation to. Not all the problems of technology have anything to do with big data, but some of them do. And these are the 4 that I distilled from those conversations. Number 1, reduction of critical thinking. It's just too easy to Google the answer. People are going to forget. They're not going to learn how to look things up in primary Jewish sources. It's going to disintegrate our skills, so to speak. That's problem number 1. Problem number 2, addiction We've become addicted to the devices, addicted to the distraction. Twitter and Google and Gmail and Facebook, all these things, they're somewhat addictive. I think anybody who's got a phone knows this. If you got a digital, smartphone, you know it, you feel it. Number three, the secular information is just way too exciting. If it's so exciting, how do we get people engaged in Judaism and Torah and scholarship and things that matter, and staka and family, when it's just way too interesting elsewhere? And number four is hate and misinformation that is plaguing us all over the internet. These are the four topics I think have some relationship with AI and big data. Okay, so let's jump into the technical aspects first, and we'll come back to those four questions. First, I want to talk about what is big data, what is AI, talk a bit about some of the cutting edge, and then we'll return to those four questions. So let's talk first about big data. What is big data? Well, before we jump into what is big data, let's talk about data. Large companies like Google and Amazon and Microsoft and so on have enormous volumes of data, exabytes of data. They each have exabytes of data that they're storing on millions of computers, which are stored in large buildings called data centers. And these data centers are placed throughout the world so that people all over the world can get reasonably fast access to data of interest to them. So to put this into context, computers store information in binary, ones and zeros. A single 1 and 0 is called a bit, 8 bits together is called a byte. 1,000 bytes is a kilobyte, 1,000 kilobytes is a megabyte, 1,000 of those is a gigabyte, then a terabyte, then a petabyte, then an exabyte. To put this into context, a megabyte is enough data to store about 3 books, 3 novels worth of information, capitals, lowercase, periods, punctuation, spaces, all that. A megabyte, you can store about 3 books worth of information. So a gigabyte is about 3,000 books. In other words, a small library. A terabyte is 1 million libraries of information. So we talk about petabytes and exabytes of data. We're talking about enormous, vast volumes of data. Where is all this data coming from? Well, it comes from the fact that we're all digitally connected, especially starting around late 90s when the internet really became the thing. And now, every time you go to a website, somebody somewhere is keeping track of that. Every time you buy something with your credit card, somebody's keeping track of that. It's not all the same company, I suppose. So that's the good news. It's like, there's not one company who knows everything about you, but there's your credit card company knows about everything you ever bought. Google knows about everything you ever searched, and so on. And it's not just the actions from people, devices are creating data also. Every car, airplanes, all the transmission lines, there's data coming from devices and objects, not just from human interaction. Businesses keep data as well, marketing, sales, employee data, customer data. So all this stuff is adding up to enormous volumes of data, and actually the rate at which we're collecting this data is increasing, not staying flat. So companies collect this data. Let's talk about how they collect it. How do they actually physically store it? They store it in 2 ways. Most companies have 2 kinds of database systems: operational database systems and analytical database systems. The operational database systems are used for transaction processing. So for example, you go to a bank, you take out $100, or you put it in $100, that's a transaction. And what's unique about that, what characterizes that operation, is that it's a very small amount of data. It's like a few rows on a spreadsheet, so to speak, very small. But it's got to be fast. It's got to be done in milliseconds. Then the other kind of data is the big data that's used for analytics. Analytics is very different. They use much larger volumes of data, and they ask more generic questions. They don't ask about your information necessarily. It's not like putting 20 bucks in the bank. But often with analytics, they're asking broad sweeping questions that look at lots and lots of data at once. So for example, show me the top selling trends of all my customers globally, grouped by age demographics. So people are in their 50s, what do they buy? People in their 40s, what do they buy? And so on. There's broad sweeping questions where you're scanning through many terabytes of data at once. That's the domain of big data. And the way that these systems store this information is they chain together many relatively small computers, and they give they sort of peanut butter the data across all of these computers. So each, if you have 1,000 computers, we'll put 1/1000th of the data on each of these computers. And now when you want to ask a question, each of the 1,000 computers computes an answer on the 1/1000th of the data, and then the result sets are merged. And so you basically put 1,000 computers to work to compute some kind of insight. And so it's a way of multiplying the processing power on these very, very large computational problems. That architecture is known as a shared nothing architecture, and it's used, almost every single company uses this for big data. There are nuances in the architecture, but at a high level, this is the strategy. Spread the data around over many, many computers and divide and conquer the computation. Now, if you want to, if you're wondering, what does this look like? Here's what it looks like. It's an actual photo from one of these data centers. You go into these large buildings, and they have rows and rows of these shelving units that they call racks. And these racks have slots where you can slot in the computers. And these computers, each of these computers is pretty similar to the kind of computer you might have at home on your laptop. Slightly different, but not terribly more powerful. There are a few obvious differences. You'll notice that there are no monitors anywhere, because when you have 1 million computers, you're not going to look at each of them individually. There's no keyboard because you're not going to type into any one of them individually. So it's just the computer part of the computer, not the monitor and the keyboard. But tens of thousands of them, hundreds of thousands of them in these buildings, consuming vast amounts of electrical power, and also a huge infrastructure to cool down the building, because the so many computers running at once that it actually gets extremely hot in there, and they have to cool it all down. So it's almost 50% of the infrastructure is just on the cooling system to keep it cold. But that's what it looks like inside these data centers. And again, millions of these in data centers around the world. So what do they use all this data for? Well, let's start first with big data, and then we'll go on to AI. Big data is used essentially for 4 things. Used to aggregate, what are my sales last month? That's an aggregation problem. It's used to interpolate and correlate, discover relationships. So for example, a famous story in the big data world is the story of diapers and beer. What do diapers have to do with beer? Nobody ever thought they had much to do with each other. Now, nobody knows that the story is true, by the way. It's just sort of one of these urban legends. But the legend goes that a large retailer in America had a big data system. And when they studied their sales in aggregate, they found that people who bought diapers also bought beer. Nobody expected this. What's going on? And what was actually going on is that, in the evening, when the husband comes home from work and the wife is taking care of the baby, the wife sends the husband out to buy diapers. It's been a long day. He's tired. He's exhausted. He's in the store anyway. He says, man, I could use a drink. And he buys a case of beer. So this idea that the sales of beer and diapers are correlated was discovered with big data, or so the legend goes. They moved the beer closer to the diapers and they sold a lot more beer. So it was a fantastic insight on their operations that turned out to be very profitable for them. Again, nobody knows if that story is true, but it is the kind of thing you can do with big data. The third thing you do is you can extrapolate. So for example, what is the stock market going to do in the next 5 minutes or in the next month? Trying to predict the future from past experience is one of the big, interesting domains of big data. And the fourth thing that we can do with big data is we can use this data to train artificial intelligence. So let's jump into the topic of artificial intelligence. What is artificial intelligence? Well, here's one definition, one possible definition. Artificial intelligence is the ability of a machine, especially a computer system, to emulate human intelligence. And the key word in all of that is emulate. We are not recreating human intelligence, we're emulating intelligence. In other words, the effect, we're emulating the effect. These artificial intelligence systems don't work the same way the human brain works. They may be inspired by the human brain, but the mechanism is quite different. And as a consequence, there are certain things that AI can do that it does actually dramatically better than human beings. You could say that AI is dramatically better at human beings, for example, at playing chess. But there are other things where it's like sort of shockingly stupid. It's like, how come the AI can't figure this out? It's so obvious that a child could figure this out, because the mechanism is very different. And in fact, another way to think of AI is that it's a class of computer programs that learn their strategies mostly by observing examples rather than by explicitly being programmed by programmers. That's actually another way to think of it that is probably more accurate. All of this comes from a set of algorithms that we talk about in the domain of artificial intelligence. Some of these you may recognize if you took statistics, like linear regression. Others are much more specific to computer science and AI. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with this term algorithm, what is an algorithm? An algorithm is a strategy that you can express with instructions. So I'll give you a simple example of an algorithm. Let's say you want to look up Martha Smith in the phone book. What would be an algorithm to look up Martha Smith in the phone book that you could express as a set of instructions? You could actually tell someone step by step what to do. Well, one algorithm might be open the phone book, put your finger at the top of the A's on the first page, and scan through name by name, one by one, until you find Martha Smith. Now, that's an algorithm. It'll work. You can describe it in instructions step by step, but it's a very, very efficient algorithm. It'll probably take you a day and a half to find Martha Smith if you don't sleep. Don't sleep, don't eat, don't go to the bathroom. You can find Martha Smith in about a day and a half. Here's another algorithm to do exactly the same thing. Since I know that Smith, I know that the phone book is sorted lexically. I know that Smith will be somewhere about 2/3 the way through the alphabet. So I'll start by putting my finger about 2/3 the way through the phone book, and wherever it lands, I'll look down there. If it's Martha Smith, it happens to land on Martha Smith, I'm done. If I'm ahead of Martha Smith, I'll scan backwards, name by name. And if I'm not yet at Martha Smith, I'll scan forwards, name by name. That's still pretty inefficient, but it's probably 100 times faster than the first algorithm. So these are just give you a feeling for it, that algorithms can be, one algorithm can be 100 times, 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times more efficient than another algorithm. But the key point is that you can describe the strategy in instructions, and that's important for computers because we program computers by giving the computer instructions. Now, what does all of this have to do with big data? Well, it has a lot to do with big data, and a key observation came from a seminal paper out of Microsoft in 2001, where they compared 4 AI algorithms, and naturally they found that some were better than others, just like the Martha Smith example. Some are more efficient than others. But more interestingly, they also explored how these AIs improved as they were given more data to learn on. And the important point is this: all of the algorithms got better. All of the AIs got better when they were given more data to learn from. It's not surprising. Human beings are like that too. The more we learn, the smarter we get. So the more they learn, the more data you give them, the better, the more effective the AI became. And that was a critical insight. Again, in retrospect, not so surprising, but maybe at the time it was a little new. So these AIs are hungry for the more data we give them, the smarter they get. So I say smarter, they're not really intelligent, but the more effective they get. One recent example of this, powerful example of this, was from a company called OpenAI, which produced an AI called GPT-3. And there was nothing brilliant about GPT-3. It wasn't any kind of breakthrough algorithm. They just fed it an enormous volume of data. Like they crawled the internet, they gave it 1,000 books, they pumped in all of Wikipedia, and they threw like 10 times more hardware at it than had ever been done before. And they created an AI that was 10 times larger than the largest AI that had ever been created. So the results from this were pretty shocking. Brute force approach to AI. And what happened was they got an AI that, this is like about 1.5 years ago, I think, that was able to do some pretty shocking things. They opened it up on the internet to 3,000 beta users. 3,000, they handpicked these people. I don't know what their criteria was. And just look at some of these examples that people posted on the internet about their experience with GPT-3. First guy got GPT-3 to convert legal text into common language. An AI can do that? Are you serious? Next guy, creative writing. He asked GPT-3, "I am feeling bored today, Grandma. Tell me a story about the time the cat stole the sun." And GPT-3, the AI, invents an entire story in response to it. The third guy on the top right got GPT-3 to actually start writing computer programs for him in the SQL language. So, these are pretty shocking results. People look at this and go, wow, like it's just brute force. There wasn't really a particularly huge algorithmic improvement in what they did, but the brute force effect was phenomenal. All right, so I want to show you a few other examples of AI to give you a feeling for this, and then we'll return back to the questions of the rabbis. So many people will debate how real this AI stuff is getting. I'm going to show you an example of one AI that I think is quite impressive from my former employer, IBM. A project, an AI system that can actually debate with human beings on topics of serious social consequence. Let's watch IBM Project Debater in action.
Real world problems, a lot of times they don't have a clear bottom line win. Otherwise, we wouldn't debate things.
According to rules set by the candidates themselves.
What we are trying to accomplish here is really to demonstrate that we can have a meaningful and valuable discussion between man and machine.
We are actually trying to show that a computer system can add, if you want, conversation or decision making by bringing facts and doing a different kind of argumentation.
Hello, Dan. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
The debater system tries to understand the concept over which we are debating.
Having analyzed the data, I will argue that we should subsidize music education.
When it gets the topic, until you hear the first speech, it's collecting all the possible arguments, trying to remove redundancy.
It is about recognizing important issues for society.
The system is evolving.
The IBM Debater can have all the opinions in the world, but IBM Debater does not pay taxes, and we do.
You are speaking at the extremely fast rate of 218 words per minute. There is no need to hurry.
The value of the technology is really to allow decision makers to take more informed decisions. There is a territory which is uncharted to some extent, and this is where we are now.
Right.
Thank you for listening.
So hopefully that was interesting to you. And you probably hear the Israeli accents. That technology was built out of the IBM Haifa lab. They have a research lab that has some really smart AI folks there. So all of this is inspired, in many ways, by human intelligence. Your brain is a collection of about 100 billion neurons, just a little bit less than that. Each of these 100 billion neurons connects to about 1,000 neighboring neurons. And those connections are called synapses. And from these neural connections, the neural network of your brain, you're able to form memories, to reason about things, and to learn as you go through life. What computer scientists are trying to do with artificial idea of the neural network, and much of the modern AI that we hear about is based on these neural networks or deep neural networks, to emulate the kind of process that goes on in the brain. However, we don't really know how the neural network of the brain works. If we did, this would all be a lot easier. So we're trying to, more or less muddle through and come up with ever better algorithms or strategies for creating these neural networks to accomplish outcomes. Let's look at another example of a powerful AI, this one called generative adversarial networks, an AI that's used to create simulations. I'm going to show you some photos of people. The first set of photos you're going to see are real people taken from an online database. As you look at these pictures, ask yourself, how do you know you're looking at a photo of a human being? You know a person when you see one, you think, you know people, you have friends, you have family, you know people, what they look like. Have a look. Now, then we'll show you some photos of human beings that are completely fictional, created by an AI. Let's have a look at the GAN. So the first set of pictures, again, these are real people. That's a real person, that's a real person, but look at them. How do you know it's a person? You see elements of age, elements of gender, elements of style. Some people are wearing jewelry, hats, clothing, comb their hair this way, that way. You see wrinkles in their skin. You know a person when you see a person. It's not a cartoon, right? It's not a graphic image. It's a photo. Let's look at some faces of people who never existed that were invented by an AI. She's a fake. So is she. Notice that she's wearing earrings. See every whisker on this guy's face, every hair on his head. This guy, you can see imperfections in his skin from when he was a teenager. all of these people never existed. You can see facial expressions, jewelry, hairstyles, all invented by the GAN simulation. So very impressive, I think, and lots of examples of how this scan technology can be used to create all kinds of simulation, not just faces, but almost any simulation that you would dream of. What about creativity? You know, we think about AI solving real world business problems, but can AI be creative? Here's an exciting example, I think, from a company called NVIDIA, where they trained an AI by feeding it lots of examples of classical music, hundreds of compositions. And after it had learned the structure of classical composition, they asked it to invent or compose an original piece in the style of just one composer. And the composer that they chose was John Williams. Now, John Williams is a very interesting choice. John Williams is the composer who composed the music for Star Wars. Now, when you hear that John Williams music, it just has that feel, that Star Wars feel. It's like 2 parts Holst and 1 part Hollywood. It's just got a certain. So let's listen to a piece of music created by an AI in the style of John Williams. The composition is called Among the Stars. It was composed by the AI, here performed by a live human orchestra. 2, 3, 4, 5. Right. Now, if you have some background in music, you may have noticed some interesting qualities of that piece. First of all, it breathed. Not all the instruments were playing all the time, like, you know, Teenage Rock Band, but the instruments took turns. There were dynamics. Some parts were louder and some parts were softer. There was counterpoint. You know, there was a piece playing in the background and there was a piece playing in the foreground. The 2 pieces meshed. That's called counterpoint. And lots of other interesting examples. There was a melody to it. And, you know, if I had a friend, a colleague who had, or a family member who had composed a piece like that, I would say, wow, you know, my friend's really talented. They went to school, they studied compositions of hundreds of, or if not thousands of pieces. They came up with their own unique original piece. Wow, what a talented friend I had. But there was no human being who composed that piece. It was an AI that learned from the examples of hundreds of compositions. But then again, isn't that what human composers do as well? They study the art of composition and then create their own interesting originals from that. And today, AI is being used all over the world, not just in social media, but in almost every single field, in business, in banking, in medical applications, in physics, weather forecasting, you name it. It's everywhere. And it's really just the beginning. It's really just the beginning, because most of this progress just started since about 2012. Really, and there's some history to that I don't have time to go into, but most of the activity is really just since 2012. So, you know, we're like 9 years into it. It's very early days, and it's moving, it's evolving and improving faster than any other aspect of computer science has improved over the last 50, 60 years. So we're living in a very pivotal time for all this AI stuff, and the impacts are going to be enormous as AI improves. What I'd like to do is now share with you, I spent a couple of minutes talking about some of the cutting edge in AI, what's coming in the next few years, and then get back to the questions of the rabbis. One of the problems that AI has is, you know, like I said, it's a different kind of processing. We call it intelligence, but it's really just an emulation. Some things it does much better than human intelligence, and other things it really struggles with. One of the things that it struggles with is what we would call common sense. It just, cause and effect. It just can't relate to cause and effect in its current form. And people are working on this with a new kind of AI called neurosymbolic AI, which tries to combine a few different AI methods, the modern AI methods of deep neural networks, with an old AI approach from the 1950s called symbolic AI, and merging these two things together. The deep learning networks are very good at, scanning an image, finding the blocks and the circles, those kinds of things. The symbolic AI is much better at, more algebraic operations. Putting them together creates the ability to infuse into AI more of a common sense analysis. So for example, if you look at this photo, are there an equal number of large things and spheres? That's a problem that today is very hard for AI to answer, but very simple for human beings. So how this neurosymbolic AI works, let's look at a simple example. If you look at the bottom left, you see the question: how many cubes are behind the cylinder are large? Now, we can use a certain kind of AI to detect the cubes and the non-cubes, and we call that a convolutional neural network. We can take the output of that convolutional neural network and store it as structured data, such as in a spreadsheet. But we wouldn't use a spreadsheet in computer science, but just to give you a sense of the kind of thing it does. Now, there's the question itself. The AI has to understand the question, and we use a different kind of AI to understand the question. And that's mostly done with a recurrent neural network to understand language. And now that we understand the language and we understand the structure, we can begin to impose symbolic logic on this to answer the original question. And so the fusing of symbolic logic and the deep learning allows us to start making these AIs much more capable. Another interesting way that AI is evolving is the multimodal AI. Until now, we've had mostly AIs that are point solutions: AI for image analysis, AI for fraud detection, AI for natural language processing. They all sort of, one-offs. But people are starting to combine these AIs, and not just as a buffet, choose the algorithm of your choice, but to actually fuse them so that they can each actually benefit from each other in a logical semantic sense. I think actually human beings do that too. When you learn to play the piano or something, it sort of gives you a little bit better at other things that are not piano as well. So there's a human paradigm from this that's coming. Another interesting problem in AI is learning with small data rather than big data. Today, AI needs a lot of data, as we talked about. Now look at this photo of a horse. You show this photo of a horse to a 2.5-year-old toddler, and the toddler can learn, that's a horse, that's a horsey, right? You show one picture and the child's got it. An AI can also learn to identify a horse picture, but it needs like 50,000 photos of horses from different angles and different colors, different environments, and it can learn what a horse is. So there's a lot of work going on right now around learning from a lot less data, which I think is very important for the advancement of the space. There's also work going on around AI ethics, making AI that's ethical, that is, trusted, explainable, unbiased against human beings. There's power efficiency work, and all these things are being very actively worked on right now, and will lead to a quantum improvement in AI over the next few years. Okay, with that, let's go to the questions of the rabbis, and I will try to go through these in about 7 minutes, and then we can wrap up. The first question was around the reduction of critical thinking. This was, rabbis are concerned about this. There were some of these 4 questions where I agreed with the rabbis' concerns and some where I didn't. This is one where I actually disagree with the concern. Not that I disagree with it, I would say it's a concern that's we shouldn't be terribly concerned with. First of all, it is true that you can Google halachic questions to get answers. So when I was preparing for today, I did a quick Google search on shaving on Chol HaMoed. Can you shave on the intermediate days, on the middle days of a Jewish holiday? And sure enough, popped up immediately all kinds of great sources for me, letting me know that I cannot shave on the intermediate days of a holiday. So it seems to be true that Google's AI that understands my question and its big data search behind the scenes to find the answers did indeed reduce my need to look up primary sources to this question. So on the surface, it seems that the rabbi's concerns were correct. However, if you look back at history, actually, we've been codifying and simplifying the ability to look up answers for a long time, starting with the Mishnah, circa 200, but many, many codifications after that, Sefer HaHalachot, the Mishnah Torah, the Torah, the Beis Yosef, the Shulchan Aruch, and more recently in the 20th century, the Mishnah Brura, all of these codifications that make it a lot easier to look at the answer to what you're interested in. And with most of these, when they were authored, at the time they were authored, people had exactly this concern. You're making it too easy. People are going to forget how to learn. But was that really true? We now have approximately 1,000 years of these codifications, making it easier to find your answers to halachic questions. 1,000 years of this. And what happened? Did everybody forget how to learn? Did we all give up on doing things the hard way, going to primary sources, learning things, doing a deep analysis? What actually happened? And here's my observation of what actually happened. This is a couple of photos from the 13th Siyum Hashas, celebrating the completion of the Daf Yomi cycle. Daf Yomi is a process of studying one page of Talmud every day for 7.5 years, and thereby studying the entire Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, in 7.5 years. In 2020, we celebrated the 13th such completion since this was started in the early 20th century. And 20,000 people at the Prudential Center in Newark, 90,000 people at MetLife Center, New York, many hundreds of thousands more in Eretz Yisrael. Nobody's given up on Gemara. In fact, the study of the Talmud, which is the fundamental analytical text of the Jewish people, has only grown. It has only grown. It is the primary text of study in yeshiva high schools. It's the primary text of study in post-high school yeshivas. It's the primary text of study for avrechim who are studying in kollel. It's actually absolutely dominant. Absolutely dominant. So I think we look back on it, the Shulchan Aruch didn't kill analytical study for the Jewish people. So I appreciate the nature of the concern, but I think in point of fact, it hasn't been a problem for us over the last 1,000 years. And I think making quick answers available on halakhic problems actually is helpful to the Jewish people, as long as people do it responsibly. And if it's a serious issue, you should go speak to your local Orthodox rabbi or halakhic source that you trust, and not rely too much on the internet. But in principle, the idea is not, I don't think it's going to hurt us too much. That was question number one. Question number two was the topic of addiction, the addiction of distraction, that we just sort of get hooked on these apps, on these phones, Twitter and Facebook and Google and Gmail and all these things, and games, certain games that people get addicted to. People start checking their phones when they're in shul, they're checking their phones when they're at home, when they should be spending time with their family, and so on. So this one, I think, is actually a very serious concern. And if you watch the social dilemma video, I think it's a very one-sided video. And you should all be skeptical anytime you watch information that presents a single point of view. You should be a little bit skeptical, but I think there is even so, there is significant truth in this concern. What these apps are all doing is they're vying for your attention. Why are they vying for your attention? They're vying for your attention because that's how they make their money. They sell ads. The more time you're online, the more ads they can show you, and the more ads they can show you, the more money they make. However, as that may sound like, say, oh, well, they're manipulating me. That's not good. Look, this is not new. This is not a new idea at all. It's a very old-fashioned idea for the last century. You watch television for free. Well, how do you think they make their money? They're selling you commercials. They're selling commercials because you watch television. Because you're watching television, they can sell advertising to companies. Radio, you listen to the radio for free? It's not free. Because you're listening to the radio, they can sell advertising. Newspapers, magazines sell advertising. So it's an old idea to capture your attention. And because they have your attention, they can sell advertising. Not a new concept. But what is new is that there is big data and AI behind this that is specializing the flow of information to your interests to keep you engaged. That part is new. So the concept is old. but it's being done in a much more sophisticated way now to keep your attention. And I think it's the emotional manipulation that people find somewhat, a little bit disturbing. AI is becoming very, very good at detecting your likes and dislikes, what will keep you watching. That said, and my personal feeling is, for someone to be online socializing with their friends and family or discussing things with business colleagues is probably still a healthier way to live your life than spending 3 hours a day watching sitcoms. So what to do about all this? I don't have any great answers. I would say the first thing that everyone should do is turn off notifications from every single app. These notifications are insidious. They beckon you to respond to the phone, to get back on the phone. Just turn that off. Check your phone 2 times, 3 times, 4 times a day. That's enough. You don't have to jump every time the thing beeps at you. Maybe keep the notifications on for your nuclear family, if your kids need you, something like that, but otherwise turn off the notifications. Number 2, get in the practice of turning off your phone at certain times a day. When you're in shul, you're attending a lecture or class, family time, 6 till 10 at night, turn off the phone. That's hard to do, but it's a useful practice. And number 3, restrict children from using apps that have any of these emotional hooks, like the likes, photo sharing. These things are very emotionally gripping, and they're probably not healthy for kids. I don't have any great answers for this one. It's serious. This is a serious concern. Third question was around the secular material getting too exciting. Let's talk about this one, which I think is important. Have a look at a page of the Talmud, Babylonian Talmud. It's really the fundamental text of study for the Jewish people. As I mentioned, it captures the foundations of our law, of many of our traditions, and is filled with vigorous debate. Rabbis over the centuries debated different halachic issues. And the edition that is universally studied today was actually published in 1886, called the Vilna Shas, published by the widow Ram. And it has a fascinating structure to it, fascinating structure. So first thing you'll notice when you look at the page, there's no punctuation and there's no vowels. So immediately you need a very high level of skill just to engage with the page when there's no punctuation, there's no vowels. Second problem, it's written in 2 different languages. It's written, part of it's in Hebrew and part of it's in Aramaic. So you need to know 2 different languages in a very legalistic manner. It's also written in 2 different scripts. If you look carefully, there's sort of the modern Hebrew script in the middle, and there's what they call Rashi script on the edges. So the level of skill that you need just to engage with the page is enormous. But skill aside, I want to point out it has a fascinating structure to it. The Gemara, the Talmud, begins with a Mishnah. That Mishnah, that codification that started in around year 200. It's followed by the Gemara, the Talmudic debates on the Mishnah in the center of the page. Then on the inside edge of the leaf is the commentary of Rashi, and on the outside edge is the commentary of Tosfot, the commentators who came after Rashi. And then surrounding on the perimeters are later additional commentaries. And so what you see is that the page itself has a spiral structure. It starts in the middle with the Mishnah, goes down to the Talmudic discussion, out to Rashi, out to Tosfot, then out to the outer edges of the other commentators. It's brilliant. It's a brilliant structure. Now, you look at that, you compare that to the Encyclopedia Britannica. And by the way, it's not just a legal discussion in the Talmud, it's also filled with anecdotes and stories and legends along the way. You compare that to the Encyclopedia Britannica, it's like no contest. Like the Britannica, here's a page of Britannica, circa turn of the century, boring, boring list of information. So in that context, yeah, wow, it's obvious which of these is more stimulating. Nobody's going to go to a lecture on the Encyclopedia Britannica. It's just not interesting. But a lecture on the Talmud, wow, that's engaging. It's intellectually stimulating. The challenge today is that we have lots of other things that have become super interesting. And I'll show you one example that is some relation to AI, which is virtual reality. In virtual reality, you put on these goggles and you suddenly become immersed in a 3D environment, 360 degrees. It's not like watching a 3D video, a 3D movie. It's not like that. It's 360 degrees up, down, all around, and you are interacting in this environment. You're not just passively observing it. I'll show you 3 quick examples. Of course, you can't really experience this unless you're wearing the goggles. But try to imagine that you're sitting in each of these three environments. Literally, you feel like you're in that world. And this is the experience that virtual reality can give you, which is going to become much more prevalent in our lives. Today, it's just a few games that teenagers use. It's going to become much more prevalent over the next 10 years and increasingly infused with AI to make it much more powerful and much more realistic. Let's have a look at these three videos. The first one in the top left is a video game called actually a fitness game. The second one on the right is an artificial roller coaster. And the one on the bottom is a scuba diving experience. You can imagine it immersed. So I'll stop there. You hopefully get a little bit of the idea. If you haven't tried these virtual reality goggles, probably worth trying out to get a sense of what's coming in the future. So, we live in a world where it's possible to create increasingly more exciting experiences than we ever had previously. There's no question that technology makes it possible. AI is going to make that even more possible. It's not a new problem. I mean, baseball was always more fun than doing your Parsha homework, or, that's not a new problem. But it's an expanded problem because we're moving from, reality worlds like baseball, playing soccer with the guys, to fantasy experiences that would be impossible to just, get up from the kitchen table and run outside and do, as it was 100 years ago. With virtual reality, you'll be able to have almost any experience you want. You want to walk the Great Wall of China? Done. You want to go do the tunnel tours in Jerusalem? Done. And you will feel like you're right there. You'll be able to have meetings with your colleagues and you'll feel like you're all in the same room, even though you're all at home. So the creation of these realities without physically being present is super powerful. So what to do? Well, first of all, I would say that Judaism is designed to be an exciting religion. When we were in the Midbar, we had a pillar of smoke by day, a pillar of fire by night. That must have been pretty exciting. After, the Torah tells us after we came to Eretz Yisrael, there were 10 constant miracles that happened every day in the temple in Jerusalem. It's supposed to be an exciting religion. I think the challenge upon us is not to figure out how to compete with all of this, but actually how to embrace all of this and take the beautiful religion and culture and history that we have and make it more exciting, make it more dynamic by leveraging many of these technologies. So we should think about what is the VR experience for Judaism? What is, can we use big data and AI to create new paradigms for learning Torah and Talmud, moving from the two-dimensional page of the Vilna Shas, which is already brilliant, as I described, but can we go to a three-dimensional model, a four-dimensional model, and create things that are ever more exciting and engaging? And the last one I want to talk about, and I'll wrap it up in a couple of minutes, is this idea of hate and misinformation. And it's a serious problem, especially for the Jewish people, not only for the Jewish people, but especially there's just a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism on the net. It's an undeniable problem, it's growing, and now the majority, according to recent studies, the majority of hate information in the world against Jews is actually online. A number of studies on this, I mentioned a few here. This is actually not a problem that's created by big data and AI. It's a problem that's created by having an internet. It's a problem that is multiplied by having social media networks that make it easy to share information broadly. But it's not really a big data and AI problem. I'll show you just this one example. On the right-hand side, you see this anti-Semitic posting. It says on the bottom, it says, even grandma can see. And in the picture, it says the Jews are up to something. Now, this is a great example of how the intelligence of AI and the intelligence of human beings is radically different. For a human being, it is equally simple to read. Even grandma can see, as well as Jews are up to something. We can read those, they look the same to us. But the difference is that the text on the bottom is actual text. The text on the top, the Jews are up to something, is not text. It's part of the photograph. Whoever made this anti-Semitic post built it into the photograph. So for a computer AI, the text on the bottom is easy to parse and discover. The text that's part of the photograph is just part of the dots in the picture. You need much more sophisticated AI to figure that out. This is part of what the anti-Semitic posters are doing in order to evade the AI so that their posts won't get caught. So they're sort of getting more and more sophisticated to beat the AI. Now, what does all of this have to do with big data and AI is this. I don't think this is a problem that's caused by big data and AI, but I think this is a place where AI can serve us very well and to some extent be the answer. With billions of online users, you cannot manually remove all the garbage and all the hate and all the lies and all the deceit. It's impossible. People often say, why didn't they take down this post, or why did they take down this post? With billions of users, it's not physically possible for human beings to take all this stuff down, even if you wanted to. But it is possible with AI. It is possible with AI to create systems that can detect lies, distortions, hate, and take it down. And there's active research, very large amounts of money being spent on this. And you can see, I just mentioned this one research paper on detecting anti-Semitism online, actually out of India, by itself interesting to me. So I think AI can serve us and come to the rescue on this one. It will take a few years. AI is new. Remember, you got to 2012 is when it really gets going. It's still relatively new. It's still, pretty embryonic. I think over the next 5 to 10 years, AI will be very capable at finding and helping us clean up the internet. So looking back at all of this, just to summarize, I think the first concern of the rabbis that the reduction of critical thinking, just the history of this over the last 1,000 years doesn't bear it out. It's a legitimate thought process, but it doesn't seem historically that it's been a problem. The addiction problem is a serious problem. I think there's steps that we can do, but it's a serious problem. Secular material being too exciting. I think AI and big data can offer us an opportunity to make our culture more interesting, more dynamic, more exciting, and we should embrace that. And on the last one, hate and misinformation, I think AI is actually the answer to this. It's not the cause, but it can be the answer to help clean up the internet. It'll take a few years for the AI to become sophisticated enough to do that. And I want to just close by pointing out, it's not all bad news. There's a lot of positive that comes from big data and AI. That's why it's used all over the world to achieve so much goodness. It's true there's some badness to it, but I think we can use these technologies to create a more exciting, more engaging Jewish experience. We could advance the way Torah is studied and correlated and cross-checked and so on. And maybe one day, then, in a future Siyum Hashas, instead of having 90,000 people at the MetLife Stadium, we'll have 3 million people collaborating together through a virtual reality experience. Who knows? So think about the ways that all this can be used for good. It's not only bad news. I know I went a few minutes over, but with that, I'll stop. Thank you. Thank you for joining and sharing.
Well, thank you so much, Sam. Absolutely provocative, fascinating, and I love the way you flipped that. And we're asking you to talk about how AI is a problem, and you're showing us how it can be part of the solution to a problem. I really appreciate that, and I thank you. I want to tell everyone who's listening, if you have any comments or questions, there's a chat button near the bottom of the page that you're looking at on your computer. If you will type in your question, it will get to me and we'll pose it after the presentations. Thank you. Let me introduce to you now Professor Henry Abramson, whom I'm sure many of you already know. A former resident here in Surfside, known to us locally, is now in Brooklyn, where he is dean at Touro College. He comes from Ontario. He did his doctorate in Jewish studies at the University of Toronto, which has for a long time had an excellent Judaic studies program, Jewish studies. And he wrote on the Jews of Ukraine in the 20th century. And his dissertation ended up being published by Harvard University Press. That's not bad. He does a lot of work with the OU on content creation for Jewish history in a Daf Yomi. And what he's working on is producing short videos on the history of each page from Shas. I think that's, I'm looking forward to that one very much. And if that's not enough, he's under contract with Koren Publishers in Jerusalem on a 3-volume history of the Jewish people. A very small topic, I'm sure. So please, we will now hear from Henry Abramson.
Okay, thank you very much, my friend. That was a very nice introduction. I should just correct, by the way, my degree was also in a very good department, but not Judaic studies. It was in the history department. But thank you. I really enjoyed the last presentation, which was just fascinating, and I think surprisingly fits very well with mine. So we have some siyata d'shmaya going on here. I'd like to begin with a very brief pleasantry. There's this story about a family living in America in the 1930s, and in order to give their teenage son a sense of the richness of life in Eastern Europe, they send him back to Radin to study there for a while, to get a sense of what was it like, living in the shtetl. And so he goes there for a year, and he comes back, and he's sitting at the table here in Brooklyn, and they're enjoying a Shabbos meal together. And they say, "So, son, what was it like?" And the son says, "Oh, Dad, it was really amazing. I met a Jew who was a misnagid. I met a Jew who was a chassid. I met a Jew who was a communist, a Jew who was a Zionist, a Jew who was a Yiddishist. I mean, it was just phenomenal." And the father says, "Well, I'm not surprised. I mean, we told you that, intellectual thought in Europe was extremely diverse." He says, "No, Dad, you don't understand. It was the same person." We're on Zoom now, so you can't hear the thunderous laughter, but all around the world right now, as people are watching this video, I'm hoping that you are laughing. And I think that this diversity of thought and of opinion, which is intrinsic to the subjects we're discussing today, big data and AI in particular, and it's essential to grasp the sheer scope and size of the amount of data we're dealing with, that'll help us understand the kind of difficulties that we may encounter as well, and perhaps even some way forward. I'd like to speak a little bit about artificial intelligence and artificial wisdom. These two things are radically different, but they're especially important for us to grasp as we are now in a digital age, influenced heavily by a philosophy called postmodernism that I'd like to look at a little bit more detail. So let's begin with, this is the before time. You may recall this for those of you who attended our last gathering. I also spoke on a very similar topic. And in fact, I'm going to plagiarize myself because I cannot stop thinking about these subjects. Last time we met, it was all in person and physical in RW and real world in Surfside. And I spoke about how the internet places us at an unusual Gutenberg moment, meaning like just as the invention of the printing press presented some radical new possibilities, as Clay Shirky, the theorist, puts it, bigger is different. And the bigger reach of the printing press led to a lot of unanticipated changes in society that we've just been getting used to over the last 500 years. And now we're hit with an even bigger Gutenberg moment with the internet. And a lot of these things have been on my mind for, maybe a decade now. And I want to follow up on that talk with some of the things we discussed today. But this was the before time. Since then, of course, we've been hit with COVID, and that has changed things even more radically. We can't forget the drone footage from Hart Island, just outside Manhattan, where we engaged in these mass burials again as a result of the horrific wave that hit this part of the world in the spring of 2019. And here it's going on right up until April 2020. Sorry, I should say 2020. I backed it up even further than I should have. And of course, the chilling memory of the temporary morgues that had to be set up in many cities. Here are some from the early summer in Brooklyn, just terrifying, the kind of things that we've gone through. And we have been radically separated from each other since we are the enemy, right? We have seen the enemy and he is us because we carry the pathogen to other people. So we've been separated as a result of COVID-19. But at the same time that we're separated, the technology was ripe for us. It's almost as if Hashem had created the refuah before the makkah for us in terms of pedagogy and education. We could all be united together through technologies like the ones that we are enjoying right now in this conference. And so while we are physically separated from each other, going now into our third year, we're still able to gather together in a new space, the internet. And I think that's going to have phenomenal implications for us moving forward. So let me back up from that preface to think a little bit about what is postmodernism and why is it relevant to the moment we're in right now. Postmodernism, it's widely called a philosophy. That's a little bit of a hard term to use. It's more, I would argue, a cultural movement. It has a few very important promulgators, Jacques Derrida, one of the most famous, Michel Foucault, and others who have brought forth this theory that works especially well in the humanities, but I would argue that it has become pervasive throughout society. My undergraduates, even coming from, the religious strongholds of the holy city of Brooklyn, are definitely affected by postmodernism in some incredibly significant ways. Just the very kind of you do you, or YOLO, you only live once kind of mentality is definitely something that has been created by postmodernism. What exactly do we mean by it? The term postmodernism means it's a philosophy or a group of ideas or a cultural movement that comes after modernism. Modernism was something that was especially prominent for much of the 20th century and finally began falling apart in the wake of the Holocaust, the huge devastations after two massive world wars, in which people began to question the sort of positivist notion that, society and technology are working hand in hand, and we are slowly pushing back the darkness of ignorance. We're slowly working towards a more ideal society, just like we're getting rid of polio, we're getting rid of hatred and world hunger, and all kinds of things are just improving. And though there may be some kind of ticks and bumps that we have to get across, ultimately the trajectory of human history is onward and upward to an ultimate redemption. Postmodernism, much like the post-World War era, begins to question this and says, wait a second, where are we getting all these ideas? So Derrida famously said, il n'y a pas de hors texte. Truth is, philosophically, there is nothing outside of the text, meaning we have this notion that human knowledge and sophistication, and especially maturity and goodness, is like building upon itself, that we are slowly gaining knowledge, we are accumulating facts, we are putting facts together. We certainly see the rate of change in our technology, in our industry, but is that not a distraction from our moral growth, which I think many people would argue has been stagnant or even has enjoyed some reversals in the last 100-odd years? The reason for this, says Derrida, is that we have confused what is stated in the text with objective reality. In reality, he says, we can never escape the subjective experience. In other words, if I look at the ancient historian Josephus, who writes about the Roman Jewish War of the first century, is Josephus actually describing what happened? Or am I not limited to the statement that Josephus is just describing what he thinks happened? Or maybe even further back, Josephus is only describing what he thinks will sell books if he says what he thinks happened. And all of these layers of subjectivity mean that we are at the mercy of only seeing the text itself. Larger meaning beyond the text is fundamentally unreachable. And this goes directly counter to the Western knowledge of the Western theory of objective thought that we see from the Greeks onward, and it brings all of it in a kind of Nietzschean way crashing down. So postmodernism says it's not really possible to speak of objective truth. One can only speak about one's own truth. This is where the you do you movement comes in, and it affects so many of our areas of life that we thought were really sacrosanct. To give you one example, for the vast majority of human history, humans have believed that biology is basically the only way that you can understand gender. And nowadays, with our incredible medical technologies, we are able to actually surgically shift biology and anatomy such that maybe gender is totally different than it ever was before. And the degree to which younger generations have accepted this as, yeah, that's the way it is, that's postmodernism at work, that some things that were absolutely fundamental historically are no longer so because of the influence of the questioning of objective truth. And in some ways, it's interesting to think that Derrida once referred to himself as le dernier juif. I am, he said, the last Jew. And in some ways that may even be true, because the type of postmodern Judaism that he posited was radically different than any Judaism that had held force beforehand. Now, I've described it in ways that we can understand it specifically in humanities easier than others, but it's also very true in the sciences as well. Sciences are a little bit harder to penetrate by postmodernism because ultimately, if you build a bridge using Euclid's axioms in modern engineering theory, the bridge stays up, right? And if you are questioning its objectivity, it's not going to change whether or not the bridge stays up. But there are, especially when you penetrate deeper and deeper into the science, lots of postmodern implications, which will not concern me at this point. And also, I should point out that there are some significant Jewish ways to approach postmodernism, most famously Rav Shagar, an Israeli thinker who has written quite extensively and very provocatively about the impact of postmodernist thought on Judaism and how Judaism can respond to this latest threat. Now, in this context, let us look at the notion of artificial intelligence and how that relates to postmodernism. Jews have been early adopters of information technology basically since it ever came out. We just embrace it. I know this is a picture of Charlton Heston as Moses splitting the seas. I'm not exactly sure why I felt I needed to include this, but maybe it's because I really like this movie since I first saw it when I was about 8 years old, and it changed my life Jewishly. But Moses looks here like he's actually embracing information technology in this sense, so that's why I chose it. Sorry for that slight tangent. But Jews have, loved information technology since, we were first working with the earliest alphabets. And then when we started putting pen to paper, which was way better than using clay cuneiform, that's the technology that Abraham would have grown up with. But later on, using quill and ink, that's so much better, and alphabets, so much better than cuneiform. And then we got into codices to actually take manuscript scrolls and make them into books, which made them more portable and easier to transport, easier to cross-reference. Although we retain scrolls for our most holy religious purposes, the Torah scroll, obviously, and in many synagogues they still use scrolls for the Haftorah, but otherwise, we adopted the Codex. It's interesting to note, by the way, that the Codex was first adopted by Christians. They liked it a lot better than Jews, and the Jews only grudgingly came around to the Codex a few hundred years later. But then in the 17th century and the 16th century, we really loved printing, which, as we heard in the previous presentation, was a huge advantage over manuscripts, much cheaper to produce. By lowering the cost of producing documents, suddenly you could expand literacy very widely. This is an early Soncino printing of the Talmud from the 15th century, and you might notice that it's fascinating. There are no page numbers, right? Nobody thought of page numbers in the 15th century when we're printing the Talmud. And that's why you can see at the very bottom of each column, there's a leading word that indicates what is the first word on the next column of text. The reason for that was to make sure that when you got the actual Talmudic volume, that you received a complete volume with all of the pages, all the folios intact. Later, someone actually thought of, hey, how about we put in actual Arabic numbers or even Hebrew numbers with a colon or not that go in the top corners, and that's how we got page numbers. Incidentally, one of the most important pioneers to put in page numbers was a non-Jew named Daniel Bomberg, who printed a very important Shas here. I'll show it to you right here. This is the Bomberg Shas, printed in the early 16th century. And so this non-Jewish printer literally put the daf in Daf Yomi. He put the page number in the daily page that we study today. Without that daf, Daf Yomi wouldn't go anywhere. But we experimented with it to look at these two examples. On the left is a Latin printing of Aesop's Fables. And the Hebrew Soncino printers enjoyed it so much that they said, let's just plagiarize it, right? That was typically done back then, format plagiarism. It wasn't considered unethical at all. But in order to use it as a title page on Tractate Chulin that's shown here, they had to actually cut it. And so you can see that there are cuts here and here so that it can be rendered in right to left rather than left to right. And they included it with the naked cherubs and things like that, which you hardly ever see. If you go to like the big yeshivas, Beis Medrash Agadol, nobody has any naked cherubs in their Gemaras anymore. It's a shame, but that's where we are. So Jews loved information technology when it came to the codex, when it came to print, and also when it comes to the internet. And there's lots of pioneers involved in the internet, especially the use of video, tremendous amount of YouTube resources, and this video as well. And I can make a small plug, as Nathan did earlier, Professor Katz, regarding All Daf, which my small contribution is that short little 2 to 5 minute Jewish history video that goes on every Daf of Shas, 2,711 of them. I'm about 2/3 of the way through the project. God willing, we'll have it all done before the next Siyam Shas. So Jews have, like Moses in that first picture, with open arms, been early adopters of information technology. How does that render us vulnerable to some of the depredations of artificial intelligence in particular? So one more kind of backward look for a second. This is really where I get to the thesis that I want to develop, that, for much of human history, we have more or less conflated the accumulation of information with the acquisition of wisdom. We used to think, by and large, that a person who was able to get lots of facts must be ipso facto intelligent. And that is no longer true. So, for example, Professor Katz mentioned my PhD, which was on the history of the Jews in Ukraine in the early 20th century. So in order to study that, to accomplish that, well, first of all, I had to read lots of books. So that took a certain amount of time. If I didn't have a book that I wanted to read, I had to go find out where it was. I could either order it through interlibrary loan and wait for it physically to arrive in Toronto, or I could physically go to the place where it was located in another library and I could read it there. And of course, I had to travel quite a bit to do that, to several different countries to read books and manuscripts and archives in those places. If they were written in foreign languages, I had to learn those foreign languages. There was no such thing as Google Translate. And after I got all of these facts together, as long as I pulled them together into one place, back then it was easier to get a PhD because the committee would say, wow, look how hard he worked. Let's give it to him already, because I had accumulated so many facts that now I had, enough knowledge to say something new, which is ultimately what a PhD is. I actually showed this picture that you're looking at right now to my undergraduates a few days ago in my honors class, where I have, the 12 most bright students in my college to discuss various issues of concern. And I asked them to identify this. Only one of 12, and these are students born after 1999, I think all of them were born about 2000, only one of them could actually correctly identify what this is. I'm sure many of you born earlier know this well. This is, of course, a card catalog system where every single book in a library would have a, these are drawers, and you would pull open the drawer and you would find little tiny index cards that would list the bibliographic data, who wrote the book, how many pages it is, and especially a call number, so you could physically write down the call number on a separate piece of paper and walk up to the stacks and find that book. You have to be very careful. If you pulled that drawer out too far, it would fall out of the cabinet and all the cards would go all over the place and it would make a big mess. I speak from painful experience. So just the sheer effort involved in gathering facts was overwhelming. But nowadays, my phone here knows way more than any of those libraries do. It has access to far greater information than the greatest possible card catalog could possibly have held in the real world. The Library of Congress, 10, 20, 30 times greater. So what does that mean? And this is especially scary for those of us who are in a transitional generation like myself and like the rest of the members on this panel, that we grew up in the pre-smartphone era. What does it mean now when our students sitting in front of us, listening to us blather on about something historical, can fact check every single word with the phone that they're holding? I mean, it's terrifying. But that is the nature of intelligence as we used to understand it. Here are a couple of dangers of intelligence and why we need wisdom, and what exactly is wisdom in this context. So I'm going to give you two examples that are also related to the history of the Talmud. The first is a rather bizarre incident that occurred at the end of the 17th century when an individual named Johannes Eisenmenger appeared before the Amsterdam Beis Din with a desire to become a Ger Tzedek, a righteous convert. He studied with the rabbis of Amsterdam for 19 years. He went through all of Shas, all of Midrashim, the entire Zohar. He was an incredibly diligent, brilliant student. He married, he had children, he was really fit into the Jewish community. He was like a star pupil. And then all of a sudden, in the year 1700, he came out with this massive brick of a work called Entdecktes Judentums. Oh, here's a picture of him. Sorry, I should have shown you that earlier. Here is the work he wrote. It's a massive brick. It had to be actually published in 2 volumes for most editions because it was just so thick, which was a phenomenal compendium of every single passage in rabbinic literature, Talmud Bavli, Talmud Yerushalmi, Midrashim, Zohar, you name it, that could be interpreted negatively to slander the Jews. The title of the book was Judaism Revealed. And what Eisenmenger wanted to do is he wanted to create once and for all a Bible for anti-Semites, that they could find in one massive concordance any possible source that would reflect badly on the Jews. Now, this was, the Jewish community in Europe was up in arms about it. They managed to stop its publications in a few places. At a certain point, he actually agreed to accept a payment to not publish it, and then he died very young, at a very young age, of a stroke. But it was too late. It was published in some places. It has now appeared even in English translation as well. And he reached his goal. He has created the Bible of anti-Semites who have a go-to source for every nasty thing that could be said in rabbinic tradition counter the Jews. Now, contrary to widely accepted opinion, it was clearly demonstrated in the 20th century that Eisenmenger did not fabricate his sources. His translations are sometimes pretty sketchy, but what he really did was he miscontextualized all of these documents, that every passage that he could find, he tried to find a way. He recorded it dutifully in the Hebrew, he translated it into German, and then he attempted to twist it to provide a distinctly anti-Semitic tone to it. And that's the part that was fabricated. But the sources themselves are pretty much overwhelmingly accurate, translations or at least citations from the text, the translations are often tendentious, but nevertheless, he is citing the text accurately. Now, when you bring this up to the modern world, one of the most frightening elements of this was an unusual experiment called TAY, which Microsoft released in 2016. And this was an early experiment in artificial intelligence where they essentially put a computer online, on Twitter specifically, and said, hey, I'm not a human being, let's have a conversation. And within hours, they had to shut it down because Tay learned from the internet to become an anti-Semite. Tay was saying all kinds of things like the Jews are responsible for 9/11 and the Holocaust didn't really happen, and all kinds of things simply because it was hanging out in the very polluted sewers of the internet. So the citations that Tay was drawing from were completely correct. She was finding all those things, if I can apply a gender to her, and she was just like learning from what other people know. So it was a lot like Eisenmenger in the sense that, she's walking in there, she's finding actual citations, but she is twisting, not maliciously, because you can't apply motivation to an artificial intelligence, but she was following the pack and generating anti-Semitic garbage. So Tay had to be shut down. That's the first example that refers to, well, let's go to the second example. The second example, which comes from the turn of the 20th century, is when an unusual individual appeared in European centers, dressed in flowing robes and wearing a magnificent turban and speaking with a perfect Sephardic accent, and claimed to be a Sephardi Tahor who had discovered the lost manuscripts of the Jerusalem Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud, which is a counterpart to the Babylonian Talmud, has a few tractates which were known in the Gaonic period, but have sadly been lost. The Babylonian Talmud is far more well studied, and certain tractates were simply lost. There's references even in the time of Maimonides that they were no longer extant. So he claimed to have discovered them, and this just rocked the Jewish world, both the academic world and the religious world. And in fact, the individual named Al-Ghazi, I think was how he termed himself, published two editions, one which was more scholarly, this one, and one which was a little bit more kind of like from feeling, that had introductions in Hebrew as opposed to in German and things like that. And he essentially had the entire world shaking with the news. Oh my gosh, these incredibly valuable lost manuscripts have now survived. They've been unearthed. He found tremendous support from Solomon Schechter, who was a great scholar of the era, the famous author of so many studies of the Geniza documents in Oxford. And he did not find open support for his work from the Chavetz Chaim, who never got to actually examine them, but he wrote at the time that he heard that these manuscripts had been discovered and that they were going to be published, and he was really looking forward to seeing them. Many, many other rabbis, however, were very thrilled and started studying these things diligently. But there was one rabbi who held back, and his name was the Rogachover. Before we look at the Rogachover and his response to the Yerushalmi, let's just take a moment to think about the Turing test, which is something developed by an early pioneer of computer thought, computer technology, Alan Turing. He was an incredibly brilliant young man who actually discovered a way to crack the Nazi code that they were using in their communications. And so he had a signal impact on the outcome of World War II. Here's a photograph of him when he was 16 years old. So he posited early on that the greatest way to measure the success of an artificial intelligence is if a computer can actually mimic a human, so much so that humans are fooled. This is actually something we heard about in the previous presentation as well. And they actually created a test where you have a blind situation where a human is communicating with at least two other entities, one of which is actually a real human, and another of which is a computer pretending to be a human, and you can only communicate in text, like with text messages. And by asking questions of these entities, could a human actually be fooled by the computer? That is the Turing test. So the question is, humans were overwhelmingly fooled by both Eisenmenger and by the pseudo-Yerushalmi. By the way, his name turned out to be Friedman. He was a fish merchant from Belarus, and he had put the whole thing, it was a total fake. He had, I forgot to mention this, oh my gosh. He had forged the entire pseudo-Yerushalmi. He did not discover those manuscripts. He actually wrote them, and it was totally brilliant. I mean, it takes a really twisted mind to be able to write a Talmudic tractate and make it feel like it's real. So how is it that people were fooled by this pseudo-Yerushalmi, and they were fooled by Eisenmenger, and could a computer possibly discern it? So to that, let's turn to the Rogachover, who is shown here. His name is Rabbi Joseph Rosen. He was a Chabad chassid. He had a rather unusual kind of personality quirk in that he refused to cut his hair. So he had like incredibly long hair, as you see in this picture here. He also was famous for communicating almost exclusively in Roshei Tevos, in acronyms. There's a famous story, I'm not sure if it's true, but I love the story anyways, about someone who repeatedly pestered him with stupid questions. And the Rogachover could tell from the nature of this communication that the person was not actually asking a question in order to get an answer, but he was rather asking a question in order to be able to brag that his question stumped the Rogachover. And the Rogachover didn't have a lot of patience for this sort of thing. So apparently he eventually wrote back to this individual, as the story goes, a long, long letter that was filled with pages and pages of references to various passages in the Talmud here and the Medrash there and so on. And so when the guy got the letter, he went around the shtetl saying, look at this, the Rogachover, my question was so hard. Look how many Roshei Tevos he had to supply to answer my question, and he was bragging about this. And then he finally went and sat down in the Beis Medrash and started looking up all those references to tease out what was the Rogachover's answer. And he realized eventually that every single reference, every single page in the Talmud that he referred him to included the word Am Haaretz, meaning ignoramus. And that it just said ignoramus over and over and over again. And that was the end of that. So in this context, the Rogachover was one of the very few rabbis who detected that the pseudo-Yerushalmi was in fact a forgery, that it was not an actual manuscript from the Talmudic era. And how did he do it? He said, amazingly, that every single tractate of the Talmud, Bavli and Yerushalmi that we have, always has the name of one rabbi who is not named anywhere else in the entire corpus of rabbinic literature. Right? That there can be a rabbi. I just happened to see in Daf Yomi today a certain Rabbi Hon, and that Rabbi Hon is mentioned in Tractate Yevamos, and he may not be mentioned anywhere else in Shas, but he is mentioned in Tractate Yevamos exclusively. So the Rogachover says that when I read all of these tractates that were written by this Al-Ghazi, actually named Friedman, I did not see any names in any of the tractates that I had not, that were totally new to me. Every one of those names were cited somewhere else. And so he said, therefore, these must be a forgery. Now, his logic is fascinating, and it's testable, it's verifiable, right? You can go back and find out if that's actually true. But whoever made the rule, whoever said that that would be true, only the Rogachover knew this. And so he applied a logical test to these documents that was entirely intuitive, or perhaps something that he had discovered on his own. A computer could only know that which is already told for it to actually master. And the Rogachover used a wisdom, something that he had actually learned ab initio from his extensive experience, to be able to detect that that was a forgery. Similarly, with the Entdecktes Judentums, the work of Eisenmenger, a computer like Tay could not recognize a malicious motive. The Rogachover would have no problem in the first page of Entdecktes Judentum, although he never commented on it. Any reader would know right away that though these citations are actually the words used in the Talmud, they're taken grossly out of context and twisted in order to achieve a malicious result. So the kind of mental energy that the Rogachover brings in these two situations is what I'd like to call wisdom. It is the hard-earned currency of experience. It's not the same thing as accumulating facts. And that's the massive difference between artificial intelligence, in my humble and uneducated opinion, and wisdom. Wisdom is something that cannot be garnered simply by accumulating more data. There has to be a level of interaction with real life experience, and there has to be a degree of extrapolation from experience that is not encoded in any kind of program that you can put into the computer. That's why, for example, I would like to tender for argument, the halacha is that according to the laws of honoring the elderly, which we have codified in our tradition, one must stand for anyone who has reached the age of 70. According to the Sephardim, there's an even stricter standard of 60. So I'm not quite there yet, but soon I'm looking forward to it. So when a person has reached the age of 70, even if they have no formal education, even if the entirety of their occupational experience has been something very humble, like cleaning streets or something, nevertheless, it is axiomatic that by the time they've reached the year 70, 60 for Sephardim, because maybe they're swifter, they have accumulated so much knowledge, and they have been able to combine that knowledge in novel ways that they actually get to the place where they have chachma, they have wisdom. It's not the same thing as a computer accumulating facts. There is a human interaction with this body of knowledge that is ineffable, and that's really what is wisdom. So where we are today, speaking to my peers, we are like the generation that knew Egyptian slavery. We remember what it was like to get a smartphone, right? That was, nowadays, the younger generation, they're like, essentially, they think in smartphone. They don't think in English. They don't think the same way we used to. And we have to understand that we have a special responsibility to convey the value of wisdom that is not well encoded in artificial intelligence. And I don't see how it would ever be possible. The reality is that postmodernism has made such an impact on our way of thinking that artificial intelligence seems to make a lot of sense. Like, for example, there are times when I go online and I need some help with my cable provider or with, some simple technological thing that needs a technical aid, and they have that little chat box that takes you to an artificial person. I know that if I ask the questions the right way, I will get the answers and the services that I need. And I don't have to bother a human, and I don't have to engage in a longer analog way of dealing with whatever my specific issue is. But that's not wisdom. And it's a shame if our younger generation fail to realize this, and they continue to exist in a postmodern morality, which is in many ways quite antithetical to our Jewish sensibilities. With that, I'd like to thank you very much for your endurance. I've spoken straight for about 35 minutes, and I should turn it back over to the panel. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Henry. Professor Abramson, Dean Abramson, that was stunning. And just one thought, and we'll move on, but that you're saying that postmodernism eliminates this human factor of wisdom and the human interaction with data. Right. But last night we were talking about how artificial intelligence eliminates just that divine soul, the value system, that gives meaning to knowledge. So I think we have an important parallel there. Well, I would like to introduce to you Franklin Zemel, Esquire. graduate of the University of Miami Law School in 1989. He's a member of the Florida Supreme Court Bar and the United States Supreme Court Bar. He is a partner in Saul, Ewing, Ornstein, and Lair, LLP. And his area in the practice of law is cybersecurity, privacy laws, and other things. But we're interested, especially in this cybersecurity and so on. He's generally considered one of the top lawyers in the area by the South Florida Legal Guide. It's high professional ratings, and so on and so on. He's very engaged with the Broward Jewish community, and he promises to frighten us this afternoon. So, Franklin Zemel, if you please.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Franklin Zemel, and my focus of my practice is privacy and cybersecurity. I've been focused on privacy issues since I was a kid, and what we're seeing now is this enormous amounts of what Sam Lightstone talks about, big data, and we're seeing how it's now actually turned against us. So that's what we're here to talk about today. The links between OSINT, which is open source intelligence, and ransomware. So this is the information we give away to strangers for free, just so they can turn around and use it against us. This is not a course in how to conduct an OSINT search. This is not a course in how to socially engineer somebody into clicking something they should not. But I could also give that course as well. So today is really just sort of an introductory course. So let me begin. Okay. If I can. Okay. So let's begin with first an understanding of what is ransomware. Ransomware is malicious code, and I kid you not, it frequently has a really cute or friendly name. It infects your devices, or it can actually impact, and it typically will, not only your entire computer, but all of the data systems that it is attached to. Once infected, the device or system becomes entirely useless. Either the device is locked or the data throughout the system is encrypted. Now this is important because the code usually spreads to all of your backups and encrypts those as well. So years ago, before ransomware has evolved, probably faster and more times than COVID-19, ransomware used to be like a gotcha. As soon as you got infected, you knew about it and everything was encrypted. Well, that's not the way it's done anymore. Now, when you've been hacked, you don't know about it at first. The threat actors will spend weeks, sometimes months, going through your attic in your basement and opening your drawers and to learn all of the secrets that are hidden in your computers. And only when they have all of that information do they then spring it on you. Most recently, the trend points towards data theft, what we call exfiltration, which leads to a double extortion, which is something I'll talk about quite a bit today. And double extortion simply means that while you're busy trying to resolve being extorted on your end, the threat actors are taking your data about your customers and your clients, and they're extorting them also. So we'll talk much more about that in a few moments. So this is one of the first. This was the hello, you've been hacked screen. This is from WannaCry. And so these are professionals for the most part. We'll talk about ransomware as a service in a moment. But for the most part, they're professionals, and they know there is nothing in the world that you can do about it. And therefore, they're very polite. So here it begins. Oops, your files have been corrupted. What happened to my computer? It explains it to you. Maybe you are busy looking for a way to recover your files, but do not waste your time. No one can recover your files without our decryption service. Isn't that nice? How do you know that they'll decrypt it? Because they tell you right there that you can decrypt some of your files for free. Try now by clicking the decrypt button. But if you want to decrypt all your files, you will need to pay. And when you pay, it needs to be by Bitcoin, which generally speaking, let's say, is completely untraceable in every way. There are some exceptions now, but let's just assume that Bitcoin is entirely untraceable. So it gives you very helpful counters. If you look on the left side, you have a couple of very helpful clocks, and you have instructions about how to pay. And if you click on the how to buy Bitcoins link on the bottom left, it'll open up a YouTube video very nicely explaining to you how to do that. So they're really quite helpful in every single way because, again, there's really not much you can do about it unless you have taken the steps before you've been attacked. So I mentioned some of the names. So WannaCry mainly attacked hospitals, and recently we are now starting to see that patients, at least one patient reportedly did die as a result of an attack on a hospital. Bad Rabbit. Bad Rabbit is especially pernicious because most of our businesses, we allow our employees to use their own devices on our network. It's called BYOD, bring your own devices. The problem is, of course, is that when they're off duty and they're at home, they can go to legitimate websites, they can go to websites they should not be going to, websites that probably the rabbi wouldn't approve of, and they can draw down from there malware, which when the device connects into your system, congratulations, you've been attacked as well. Another one is called Jigsaw. Jigsaw is really kind of my favorite. Jigsaw got its name from the movie series called Saw, which I don't recommend that anyone should go watch. It is exceptionally bloody and gory. However, Jigsaw would gradually delete your files each hour that the ransom wasn't paid. And the use of the horror movie imagery caused victims extensive emotional distress on top of the stress of figuring out how to undo what's just happened to them. So the question really comes up, what happens if I don't pay? Well, if you don't pay, get ready to accept a complete loss of your data. Think about what that is. That's all your financial data, your financial reports. Okay? It's access to your bank accounts, access to your investment accounts. Your employee health information is gone. Your trade secrets, your archives, your backups. And again, in the good old days, when the data was just encrypted and eventually destroyed, was not as nearly as awful as now with data exfiltration. Because now they will look at your financial reports, and they'll look at your bank accounts, and they'll decide how much you can really afford to pay. So if you say to them, I can't afford to pay what you're asking, I can only afford to pay less, they're happy to send you back your financial statements and bank statements and say, you have plenty of money, you can pay it right here. Your trade secrets, gone, and potentially sold to your competitors. And of course, again, without your archives and without your backups, how do you restore? So those are consequences, some of the consequences of what happens if you don't pay. You can also expect your business to be shut down for weeks, maybe months, maybe never recover. The recovery expenses themselves typically are about several $100,000 depending upon the complexity and the size, but we're seeing recovery expenses now averaging about $3.5 million. That's typically what we're seeing in our clients at our particular level. What else do you lose if you don't pay? Well, you're going to lose your customers because you're not going to be able to communicate with them. All of their past order history, gone. All of their current orders, gone. Work in process, gone. Reputational damages. Okay, so reputational damages is very significant. It's hard to put a dollar value on it, but you're the company that got it hacked. You're the company that wasn't prepared. You're the company that allowed your client and customer data to be stolen and used against them. Not very helpful. Then come the lawsuits, including class action lawsuits. Now, there is no federal data privacy law. That does not exist, and I doubt anytime soon that our Congress will ever get behind one for a lot of different reasons. So the states have been acting on their own. So California has been the lead dog on this. Florida is currently considering it. North Carolina, a lot of states are now, Illinois, a lot of states are passing their own consumer data protection acts. And they're similar, but they're different. And these laws typically allow class action litigation against anybody that releases, voluntarily or otherwise, protectable consumer data. So trying to manage protection against all of these different states and laws, very, very complex, very difficult. And so getting hacked, getting hit with a ransomware is exceptionally dangerous. There's also the FTC. Now, there is no federal privacy law, but the FTC does have what's known as Section 5 or Article 5. And that is a consumer fraud statute. What does that mean? That means that if a company implies that it will protect consumer data and it doesn't, it could very well lead to federal action as well. And here we are again, we're talking about the double extortion. So if you don't pay, your client's secrets are going to get exposed. And many times you're going to hear from very angry customers and clients, hey, you need to pay. Whatever this is, this guy says that he's going to release all my data. Unless you pay that, you guys need to fix this right away. Then there are what I call extra critical threats. In particular, law firms and accounting firms. So law firms and accounting firms have their own obligations to protect their clients' confidentiality. So that puts law firms and accounting firms into a very difficult box. Not if, but when they get attacked. Because if they don't pay, then their clients' secrets and confidences will get revealed. So imagine law firms in the middle of high stakes litigation. All of a sudden, their clients' information is released publicly, or your clients are extorted separately. What about accounting firms or other law firms and accounting firms who are involved in major transactions, merger and acquisitions? Somebody's going public, and that data is not only stolen but used against you. hospitals and healthcare professionals. So when they get hacked, patients die. So you can imagine the extraordinary impetus and stress on all businesses, but in particular these, to pay this ransom. And hospitals also have their own separate obligations under HIPAA and consumer privacy class action. They can expect that as well. So, the solution is obvious, right? You should pay. So what happens if I do pay? Okay, so let me just tell you that the U.S. federal government will tell you that if you pay, there's no guarantee you're going to get your data restored. And that, of course, is true. But on par, the vast, vast majority of threat actors honor what they say they're going to do and restore your data if you pay them. Why? Because it's a business. If the reputation of the threat actors were such that if you pay, you're not going to get your data restored, the business model will collapse. So it's likely that most of your data will be restored. Most of your data. It is very likely that 100% will not be restored. That's usually as a result of file corruption. So that's the risk people are willing to take when it comes to their decision if I pay. But now comes the U.S. federal government. So OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control. For the last couple of years, OFAC has been warning us not to pay. And they have been turning up the heat quite a bit by reminding that it is in fact a federal crime to conduct business with certain nations and their affiliates. It is a violation of the Trading with the Enemy Act as well as other federal laws. And if you are found to have violated Trading with the Enemy Act, you can expect some of the guys with shiny badges and no sense of humor of any kind to come knocking on your door. It is very unpleasant. Last month, the U.S. federal government updated its guidance, and it now requires banks and other financial institutions to monitor and report suspicious activities such as ransomware payments. So, you go into your bank and you start asking your bank officer, how do I buy Bitcoin? How do I do this? How do I do that? They're required to report that. So that's our government telling us that if you do pay, you could end up violating federal law and have some serious problems on that end. So who are these threat actors? Well, we hear about them a lot. They break down into three categories. One, of course, are nation-state actors. Okay, Russia, China, North Korea, and others, right? And we'll talk about. Sorry about that. We'll talk about China for just a moment. So there is currently pending an attorney malpractice case with respect to a Chinese dissident who was represented by a major law firm. And the Chinese dissident, in terms of getting his immigration approved here, and he reportedly warned the law firm over and over and over that you needed to protect his data. And they insisted that they had protected it, and sure enough, China hacked it and released all of it into the public, severely damaging. So now the law firm has been sued. So Russia, China, North Korea, and others, what are their motives? A lot of the motives are money. A lot of the motives are damaging infrastructure. Organized crime. They're really just about money. But what we're really seeing now are amateurs. These are the 18 and 19-year-old kids, the 20-somethings, who can't even spell ransomware, yet they're engaged. Why? Because the ransomware is now sold as a service. So you've heard of software as a service. That's what this is. It's ransomware as a service. And they lease it, or they pay a commission of whatever they recover. And that's how that works. So if you think that, well, I'm not going to get hacked by a nation state, I'm not going to get hacked by organized crime, guess what? You're going to get hacked one way or another by those using the ransomware as a service model. Okay, so all right, so how can your business fall victim to a ransomware attack? That's really our question. So by far, the most likely way of getting attacked is through an infected email or a text message that encourages the recipient to click a link. There are a lot of different names for these. Okay, one is called phishing. Phishing is like throwing out a giant net. Okay, it's undifferentiated. You send out a mass email with a link designed to get people to just generally click, and those who click, they've been had, right? So we've seen a lot of these. This is all part of social engineering that we're going to talk about. So, one that's going around right now that's very popular is an email that says that recently your car was photographed as running a red light, and that the fine is $275. Click here to view the video. And sure enough, who isn't expecting that email, right? So everybody's expecting to get one of these days. That is exceptionally productive right now in terms of phishing. Then comes spear phishing. Spear phishing is a targeted attack. It is a way to target, let's say, Dr. Henry Abramson, who was so gracious enough to tell us all in his presentation what his Amazon account is, because I now have that. By the way, I ordered about $2,000 worth of technical equipment. Thank you. So spear phishing targets a specific person. And how does that work? We're going to talk about in a minute. Whaling. Whaling is also spear phishing, but whaling looks to take out the CEO of a major company, somebody at the highest level. Why? Because the person at the highest level is going to have the greatest access to data. And so they themselves are targets. But we should also be aware of vishing. What is vishing? Vishing is good old-fashioned voice. Getting a phone call. Hi, Mr. So-and-so. I'm John Smith with IT for your company. And we're aware that there's recently been a hack. Can you please confirm your password credentials for us? Oh, sure. Here they are. Vishing. Very effective. What makes these effective is they come from what appears to be a familiar sender. Your colleagues, your friends, your children. How do they know? How do they know? Your friends, your birth dates. How do they know? They know it through open source intelligence, OSINT. Open source means that it is legally and publicly available. It is the information which usually we voluntarily make public. A lot of it is information which government and other companies make public for us. But it is completely legal and is publicly available. And there are dozens of books and courses and YouTube videos on how to use open source intelligence in order to hack somebody. Okay? And of course, there's different hackers. There's the so-called white hat. They work to help companies identify and protect. And of course, you have the threat actors are typically the black hats. This is courtesy of inteltechnique.com. This is an OSINT workflow chart. And this is just a very basic workflow chart, okay, which just shows you start with the real name and all the different ways that you can go in order to gain data. You'll notice that one of the people search engines, the first one is called People, P-I-P-L. This is an extraordinarily robust search engine. If you really want to scare yourself, go get a temporary account and search your name and see about the stuff that you didn't even know about you. So we have all of these search engines. Obviously, it refers to Google, Facebook, custom tools. By the way, Facebook has really tamped down on the searchability over the years. So they're clearly making efforts to address the issues, and so I applaud them for that. A couple of years ago, probably wouldn't have said that, but they're definitely making progress. But we still are voluntarily choosing to put our data out there, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, you name it. We're the ones that are putting it out there. So by far, Google is the most popular search engine. It's not even close, by far. And everybody just runs what we call natural language searches on Google. Okay, so somebody could type in, as Dr. Katz began, what does the Torah say about privacy? And Google will report all kinds of results back to us. Okay, and then you can sort them any which way that you want, and you can go through, and maybe there's an answer, maybe there's not. But I want to talk about Google dorking. Google dorking are highly sophisticated search queries through the Google engine, which very few people are really focused on. And so, as I said, this was not intended to be, this is a basic primer on OSINT. These are just some basic searches from Google dorking that you probably haven't thought of before. So I volunteered myself for this one. So the first Google dorking search query is what's called a site operator. So if you typed in site:facebook.com and then you put my name in quotes, you're going to learn just about everything about me that's on Facebook in the one simple search. Okay, and that's not going through Facebook. That's going through Google. You'd find out that I'm involved at Nova Southeastern University. You'll find out that I'm quite involved in Jewish Federation of Broward County, and you'd probably learn that I'm a black belt in Korean martial arts. So you would learn that information. Why is that information important to a threat actor? It's called phishing? No, it's called spear phishing. Okay, we'll come back to that in a moment. You could also run site:amazon.com and plug in somebody's name. This one's really kind of interesting because that will return all ratings and product comments that person has ever made. Your ratings and product comments are public. It reveals your recent purchases and your recent returns. So think about that. I'm a threat actor. I'm looking to get you to click on something. I could send an email from, looks just like it came from Amazon, and the title of the email will say, about your recent purchase of X, or about your recent return of X. This is all social engineering. By accessing site.facebook.com, Somebody could fake an email from one of my mentees. They could fake an email from Federation. What they would likely do is go to the website for the Jewish Federation, find out who is the chairman of the board or other high-ranked officer, and then replicate an email to me that looks like it's coming from the chairman of the board of an organization which, of course, I would otherwise trust their emails. And boom, just like that, I have been hacked. Another type of Google dorking is file type operators. You can actually try this while you're online. Okay, so you can actually search for the quote Citrix Confidential unquote file type :PPTX if you're looking for confidential PowerPoint presentations that contain the phrase Citrix Confidential, or you can say file type DOCX or file type : You can also search for documents which are unprotected out there in the universe called password.log. And oh my goodness, will you be shocked at the unprotected documents that are out there that have hundreds of company employees. Somebody was doing it in a Google Doc, it wasn't password, maybe they got fired the day before they had a chance to close it, doesn't matter, it's out there. Another type of social engineering search is to go to images.google.com and plug in a name in quotes and see what you get. This is exceptionally helpful because it helps identify what you look like, okay, and provides access to any other image associated with an article or a book to which you're linked. Something that we use quite a bit because it's like exceptionally powerful is the Wayback Machine. So the Wayback Machine archives all websites. Okay, think about that. Okay, it is constantly searching, crawling, they're called spiders, and they are tearing down every single web page, and not just the front page, not just the splash screen, but everything which is publicly accessible is all being copied, indexed, and archived. So this is cool. This is the splash screen when you go to wayback.org. So if you look, you'll see that you can pick the year, the month, and the particular day. So this is exceptionally frightening, exceptionally powerful. Well, how do you use it if you're social engineering? Well, that's simple enough. If somebody wants to target me, they go to my current bio. They can search in depth. What they can also do is they can then look at earlier versions of our webpage. Go back 2 years, go back 3 years. They can start identifying former employees, lawyers who've left the firm. And then they can replicate an email from a former partner of mine and send it to me to get me to sign off on it. Okay, next. Okay. This is also interesting. A search of the internet, your Google dorking, will reveal some really fascinating things as well, such as unsecured private webcams. Okay, think about it. Everybody's got webcams. You think they're secure? Are you actually using the manufacturer's suggested original password and credentials? Ouch. So unsecured private webcams, they're out there by the gazillions. What's the harm? Well, the harms are you could have an unsecured private webcam that reveals post-it notes, like on your computer with your password, or over-the-shoulder surfing, where the camera may be behind you in such a way that it's watching what your passwords are when you're logging into something. So that's another form of way to socially engineer. There are millions of open networks, companies that have holes in their systems that are just open, that not everything is closed. And so there's open networks, there's open FTP servers, IoT devices, the Internet of Things. Boy, this is great. So we got a recent hot water heater, and I said, wow, this is great. It comes with its own app so that I can control my hot water heater from anywhere in the world. That's great. Well, guess what? The manufacturer of the hot water heater doesn't know anything about building apps or app security. It's not what they do. So what do you think they do? They outsource it to the lowest bidder. And they have no idea, no control whatsoever of the app security. So you can connect these apps to your devices, but anybody can hack these without any question. And once they're in to your system, they're into your internet controllers, and they can monitor your traffic, install key loggers, and take down everything with you. So it's particularly dangerous in my view. And anyway, the one drawback of Google and Google dorking is that it tracks the searcher's identity. So if I were going to start trying to hack, say, Dr. Katz, I'd be leaving trail behind me. I can try to create a fake persona, but even that leaves tracks. So DuckDuckGo to the rescue. DuckDuckGo doesn't maintain records of any searches, nothing. It's completely anonymous in every way. But there are dozens of anonymous search engines which are used. So now, let's turn to our favorite topic, social media. This is a treasure trove of personal data. So I can go and I can search for any one of our speakers or anyone else, and in a few moments, I will know your full name. I will know your nickname. I will know your birthday. I will know about your elementary school, your high school, your colleges. Why is that important? Does anybody ever heard of a secret question? You get them all the time. It's supposed to be password security. So you log in, you ask for a password reset, and you get a secret question, such as, what is your mother's maiden name? What elementary school did you go to? And on and on. So anyone looking to spearfish or whale somebody, this is where we're going to get it. Okay? I will also know who your family members are. I will know who your family members' birthdays. Why is that important? Everybody gets e-birthday cards. Well, this is a no-brainer. Since I know your son's name, all I have to do, and I know your birthday, all I need to do is to fabricate an e-Hallmark card. It sure looks like it's from your son. You're certainly expecting to get an e-card from your son. After all, it is your birthday today. And so there it is. And you're going to click on it, and well, there goes that. It reveals your employment history. Pretty much know everywhere you've ever worked. Why? Because you put it on LinkedIn. Everything that we need to know. Your political affiliation. I know who your friends are. And I can cross-reference your friends against their friends to find out who are the common people in between. It's really unbelievably powerful. Groups. How many of you are in a Facebook group or some other group from your elementary school? Wouldn't it be great if all of a sudden you got an email from somebody you haven't heard from in 40 years or 50 years who remembers that you went to PS 121 or whatever elementary school you went to? How would they know? That's got to be real. Click. Geotagging photos. I really shake my head on this one because when we are posting photos online, those photos are filled with metadata. Okay? It's very rich in data, including where the picture was taken, when the picture was taken. I love this one, the what's on your mind. Talk about opening the door to a spearfish. Just tell the hackers what's recently on your mind, and you'll get an email from someone who's going to help you with it. But the one that fascinates me is this one, vacations. Are you currently away? Are you sharing with the world that you're currently in Vail, even though they have no snow? Why would you do that? Why in the world would you broadcast to the world that there's nobody at home right now when my house is vacant? There's no one there. Please come rob me. Why do we do that? Favorites. Favorites of anything and everything. Remember, secret questions. What's your favorite color? What's your favorite food? What's your favorite restaurant? What's your favorite gym? And then what's also out there are your current and historical posts. It's all out there. Every post you've ever made in your life is there. And all of that is data which is rich to be used against you. Another thing which is also valuable are company websites. So recently, this was really brilliant, which is the company websites reveal who are the officers and directors. So who are the whales? The company websites are going to tell us the company structure. Who are the divisions? Who's the leadership in each division? Tells us their name. Tells us their title. We get the email formats across the entire domain. We know how everybody's email address should look like, so we can replicate it. We know company projects. Many times companies will tell us who their clients are. This is rich for a threat actor to compile a fake email from one of your clients. And it's sent to the proper email address and title, and it will have the names. It will sound very familiar. The help wanted, which we see on a lot of websites, this will attract a lot of fake applicants. And so your human resources will get an application and they'll click on the link and, well, that's the end of that. If we go to your company websites and we look at your IT side, we go to About or we look at it and we see that there's a whole section there on IT, especially if they're hiring. It tells us what company systems and frameworks the company uses. How do they do that? We're currently looking to hire an assistant director of IT with substantial experience in XYZ. Well, you're just broadcasting to the whole world what framework or systems it is that you're using, and obviously you're having a problem with it. So anybody can then just email them and say, hi, this is Bob, CEO. I'm having a real problem with that company system. Can you help me? Lastly, the dark web. This is a graveyard for your stolen credentials and passwords. Billions of credentials are stolen a year. This is where they go. Your data is for sale. All of this is being used against us. So that essentially hopefully summarizes what is ransomware and how our data, our information is used against us. So with that, I'll turn it back to Dr. Katz.
Wow. Wow. Franklin, you scared me. You intrigued me. Obviously, why I'm scared, I'm intrigued because I want to go home and try some of this stuff and see what I can learn about myself. But you also outraged me. Something about this offends something deep in me. And I think that what that is I just assume I have a right to privacy. Obviously, I don't. Yet, what seems to be a common theme is that all of this is invasion of what I believe to be my privacy. All this works without your knowing it. It's surreptitious. So, our last talk for this session is on what is privacy according to Torah and Chazal. And maybe if we can understand privacy, we might be able to understand this phenomenon that is just been so ably described. So let me introduce Rabbi Dov Schochet. He is my colleague here at CYS College. He's the Rosh Yeshiva, or principal of the college. He teaches Talmud, Pirkei Avos, ethics, prophets, and Torah, and so on and so on. He's a wide range. He got his smicha, his rabbinic ordination, from Kollel Tiferet in California, and then received a higher organization of a dayan, a judge, in Sydney, Australia, from Rabbi Moshe Gutnick. After marriage, he moved to Jerusalem. He studied at Tzedek Shul, where I've davened a number of times, and it's a great place. And he also received his license from the state of Israel to be a rabbinic lawyer. I didn't know it was such a thing, authorizing him to argue cases in front of rabbinic courts. Most fascinating. So let me welcome, sitting right next to me, my colleague, Rabbi Dov Schochet.
Thank you. So I want to start with the story of Danny Kylo. Danny Kylo was a man living in Oregon, and he was arrested. His case ultimately went to the Supreme Court in 2001. There were some federal agents that felt that he was growing marijuana. Once upon a time in this country, that was a crime. He was growing marijuana in his house. So what they did was they used some infrared imaging to see if there was extra heat coming from different places in the house, which would be an indication marijuana was being grown there. And they actually discovered, without any search warrant, but they discovered with infrared imaging, never entering his house, just from the heat coming out that the house was emitting, they discovered that there was the signs of marijuana. They got the warrant, they entered, and they arrested him, and he was convicted. He appealed his conviction. He said the Fourth Amendment protects us against unreasonable search and seizure. They searched without a warrant. They had no right to check the heat coming out of my house, and therefore the entire conviction is based on the poisoned apple, on an illegal search, and therefore it has to be vacated. Initially, the judge ruled against him. The appeals court ruled against him. In 2001, the Supreme Court took up the case. And it's a very fascinating question. Does a person have the right expectation of privacy with the heat that his house is emitting? And the minority said, you don't. It's something coming out of your house. It's not in your house. And anyone that knows the current politics of the Supreme Court would be surprised that the majority decision was written by Justice Scalia, along with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and Stevens was on the other side. And he wrote that a person has no expectation to privacy with heat that anybody walking by the house would be able to feel. Whereas the majority ruled that that's not actually accurate. When the Constitution protects us against unreasonable searches, it includes things that we expect to be private. We don't expect people to have the technology to be able to measure the heat coming out of our house that our house is emitting to determine if I'm growing marijuana in that house or not. And therefore, because the person has that expectation to privacy and the government violated it without a warrant, therefore the conviction was overturned. What's the significance of this story? Number one, it gives us a pretty good idea of what does it mean when we expect privacy and the contours of this question. What does privacy mean? Does privacy mean the things that I'm speaking, the things that I write, things going on in my house? What rights do other people have to invade that privacy? And when is it considered an invasion? But maybe more importantly for the general discussion I hope to have, is it tells us something important. The Constitution was written hundreds of years before infrared technology was even an option. And yet the Supreme Court managed to take a constitution that was hundreds of years old, at that point over 200 years old, and apply it to a very modern technology. And we'll try to do the same thing today. We're going to speak about digital footprint, the right to privacy, my digital information, social media. And we're going to try to apply these principles based on Talmudic law, which was written literally 1800 years ago, when the mode of transportation was, horses, or primarily for most people, walking. Society dealt almost entirely with agrarian agricultural things. If you wanted to write a document, it was written on clay. Maybe if you were a little more modern, you had papyrus. And yet that same Talmud, if we're able to find the issues, if we're able to determine what's at stake, what are the principles, the Talmud will be able to illuminate and maybe give us some insight in how to deal with these extremely modern questions. Each of us has a digital footprint. And after the last presentation, I must say, I'm very pleased to know I'm not on Twitter, haven't been on Facebook in probably 15 years, not on Instagram, and I probably will sleep a little more securely tonight because of that. But each of us leaves a digital footprint at the places that we shop, and as all the previous presenters were able to so articulately put it, all of this information being gathered collectively but individually. And then we have, besides for that digital footprint, by those, literally those the cookie crumbs that we leave all across the digital landscape. Besides that, we have our social media, in which we're speaking to people, we're engaging people, expressing opinions, sharing information about our life. So there's two real questions over here. Number one, who owns that digital footprint? Who owns the information that we have? The information that's available online about me, my private information, where I've gone, where I've been, what I shop at, what I say, who owns that information, who has the right to that information? And as we've heard, that many countries actually have laws about the ownership of this information. In Europe, they have laws. In Canada, they have laws. The United States, in a federal sense, not so much. But here's question number one, from a Torah standpoint, who owns this information about me? The second question is maybe less about an ownership question, who owns the information, but what rights do I have? Even if the information is not owned by me, it's not mine, what rights to privacy do I have? Or maybe in a more general sense, what's the Torah's perspective on privacy? Can anyone look at my Facebook page if I don't want them to? Can someone read a post which I hid, which I made only for friends, but someone who's not a friend, do they have the right to read it? But maybe in a broader sense, should we be posting on Facebook? Should we be sharing all of this information? What does the Torah have to teach us about the general concept of privacy, maybe modesty? And those are the types of questions that we'll try to answer today. So when it comes to the ownership question as to who owns my digital data, who owns that footprint of mine, all of those cookies that I leave scattered across the web, the most obvious answer would be that the companies own it. And the reason is because I consent to that ownership. Every time you get an app, every time you go to a new website, especially websites from Europe, there's a consent form. You have to accept their terms and conditions. And as soon as you consent, in a certain sense, you gave them the right to do with that data exactly as they please, exactly what they write in that consent form. You've agreed to it, and that's the end of the question. You have a contract with them. You use their service, you agree to their terms of service. So in a certain sense, that's the end of the story. But from a halachic standpoint, from a Torah viewpoint, that is far from accurate. Because in order for a contract to be valid, in order for me to contract with anyone, there has to be an understanding of what I'm contracting to. If I make a deal with somebody else and I sign the contract, but I don't know what the contract says, that's not a binding agreement. I have to know what I'm agreeing to. And in fact, you have the simple law that the Shulchan Aruch teaches us, that if a person comes to his friend and says, I have a box I'd like to sell to you, I'm not going to tell you what's in the box. It might be something very valuable, a beautiful diamond, a Rolex watch. It might be something not so valuable, and I'll sell it to you for $200 and you'll take a risk. Such a contract is not binding because I don't know what I'm buying. I don't understand what I'm getting into, and therefore the entire contract is void. And there's a good argument to be made that when I click accept on those consent forms, the terms and conditions with an app, the terms and conditions with a website, nobody knows what those terms and conditions actually say. They can write in those terms and conditions, by January 1st, we will have the right to take your house if you use this website, and most of us would be none the wiser. Of course, there are those nitpickers, the people that actually read through every word, and they make sure that it doesn't say that. But for the broad majority of people, for most people, that agreement that we make, that which we accept the terms and conditions, is in a sense meaningless because we don't know what we're consenting to. Because of all the legalese, because of all of the necessary verbiage that these websites require because of their legal teams, that from a halachic sense makes it less valuable because it means that the average person is consenting to something they're unaware of. So the terms and conditions, the consent, the contract for internet service, that on its own would not give the website ownership unless I fully understand what I was engaging in. And when you go to a European website where they have much stricter laws than we have over here in the United States, they actually have very broad, unambiguous language on the front of the page. By reading our website, you are consenting for us to collect your data and to use it X, Y, or Z. That would be a more halachically binding contract when the language is clear, it's unambiguous, and the consent is understood by all the parties. But there's something maybe a little more fundamental from a halachic standpoint. When I ask the question, who owns my digital footprint? Who owns my social media? Who owns all of the information I put online? There's a certain assumption I'm making that it is possible to own those things, that it is possible to have ownership of these types of objects. And while as Americans and with American law, there are many things we take for granted, halacha has a very different perspective or view of ownership. So for example, one basic halacha that any budding Talmudist would know is that you cannot sell something, you cannot contract about something shaloi bo la'olam, which has not yet come to the world. If I'm a farmer, I'm living in Iowa, and I'm expecting to have 80 bushels of corn in the next season, and I need some cash. So I go to my neighbor and I say, I'll sell you those bushels of corn for $10 a bushel. I'll give you a better price. I'm selling it to you early. Forget about any issues of interest. It's a loan. There's a return on the loan. We'll ignore that for the moment. Halacha says that that contract is simply invalid because you contracted with something which you don't have. A contract with something that you don't have, something that's not yet in the world, is not valid. And even if the object is here, I'm intending to buy a house, and I intend after buying that house to sell it to my neighbor, and I tell him, I will buy the house and sell it to you, let's make the contract. Again, that contract is not binding, unenforceable, and void from a halachic standpoint. And the reason for that is because I sold something that I don't have. So here we see from a Torah viewpoint, from a Torah perspective, to own something, it has to be something tangible and in my possession. Now, this has far-reaching ramifications in so many areas of law today. A lot of the American economy, a large segment of our economy, is intellectual property. And we have copyrights, patents. You develop a drug, COVID-19, you have drug companies, valuable vaccines, they have patents to those vaccines. From a halachic standpoint, all of these trademarks, copyrights, patents, are in a certain sense owned by nobody. They are ideas. They're not tangible things, and therefore they cannot be owned. So I'll tell you a famous story. This is going to the 16th century. There was a rabbi that lived in Holland, or in Italy, sorry. His name was the Maram of Padua. And he decided he was going to put together, to typeset, a critical edition of Maimonides' text, which is a very important work for any scholar of the Talmud, for any Jewish scholar. And he was going to put in the time to make a new edition of the Talmud of Maimonides. He was going to fix a lot of the mistakes that were in earlier editions. He was going to add some comments. He was going to add his own comments to this. And it was a very laborious job. Unlike today, where you have computers that can typeset immediately, going back to the concept of AI, artificial intelligence, that they can arrange this. Once upon a time, you had to literally map out every single page, every word on the page, the commentary, so it should all be consistent and it should all run in uniformity. He puts in all of this effort, but at that time, Jews were not allowed to print. So he goes to one of the top printer of Jewish works at the time, and their negotiations break down, and he's not able to come to an agreement of how he's going to sell, he's going to sell him his work. He's going to print it on his behalf. He goes to another printer that has the rights to publish in Venice, and this printer accepts their agreement, the terms, and they print this new work, which at tremendous expense to this Rabbi, the Maram of Padua. The original printer is not happy. He was basically the only printer of Jewish books up until that point. And here someone else is competing with him. He's not interested in losing market share in his very lucrative business. So he decides to basically take this copy of Maimonides and reprint it, and then sell it for 1 gold coin cheaper than the print being sold by the competing publishing house. He was a wealthy man, and he was able to afford to take a loss. He was able to afford to lose money selling each one, just to put the other publishing house and the Maram of Padua out of business. So the Maram, he sends a letter to a very famous European rabbi. His name was Moshe Isserles. He's the author of the Ashkenazic Compendium of Jewish Law. He wrote what's called the Mappa, the Ashkenazic rulings that are attached to the Shulchan Aruch. He was his relative. He lived in Warsaw at the time. Most Jews that were going to buy this work were probably living in Poland at the time. So he turns to him. He wasn't as famous as he ends up being by the end of his life, and he asks him for a halachic ruling. Now, obviously, this Gentile publisher in Venice could care less what the rabbis will say, but the Ramah had actually a very powerful tool at his disposal if he should see fit to use it. He can decree a ban or an excommunication on anyone that will buy the competing set of Maimonides and doesn't buy the one from the Maram if you buy the competing one, because you're doing something wrong. So he writes a response, his cousin asking, or his relative asking to write a response of why he should be the one that's the other Maimonides, set of Maimonides should not be available for other Jews to buy, and no Jew should be allowed to buy it. Now, from a modern perspective, from the way we think about intellectual property, the answer is very simple. He owns this text. He created this text, meaning the layout and the format of this text. He put the effort into creating this text. Somebody else that uses that information that he put together is stealing his information. But that's not what the Ramah wrote. That's not what Rav Moshe Isserles wrote, because there is no concept of owning ideas. You can't own an idea in Jewish law, so you can't say someone is stealing something if it was never owned in the first place. But he did come up with all sorts of reasons to argue that this was an illegitimate copying of the text, and therefore people are not allowed to buy it. There's a very unfortunate postscript to that story, that the original publisher got upset about this. He took different Jewish works to the authorities. He pointed out some anti-Christian or anti-Gentile passages in it, and it caused the Talmud to be burned throughout the country of Italy. So the type of logic he used was, number one, if you're a Jew, you should be buying from a Jew before from a Gentile. Also, he says there's a rule that when there's a Torah scholar trying to sell something, he's the first one that has access to the marketplace. He says probably because he's such a great scholar, he's able to have an amended text, whereas the Gentile doesn't understand it as well, and there's a concept we shouldn't have corrupt texts in our house, and the Gentile won't be able to be certain that his text is not corrupted. And finally, he said, over here there's an idea that you can't put somebody out of business. If a person invests in a business, you cannot compete in a way which is anti-competitive, meaning predatory pricing, below market pricing. Torah does not allow for anti-competitive competition, meaning to say in a way which forces somebody out of business. So for all of those reasons, he said, one is not allowed to buy the competing Maimonides. But most interesting is that not once does he say that this particular layout was created and owned by this rabbi, and anybody else that takes it is stealing and you're buying stolen works. A similar concept, again, which we're quite familiar with when it comes to modern law, is anti-compete clauses. It's very common today in an industry that if a person gets a job with a tech company or in a specific industry, that they'll write in that if you get fired or if you quit, you're not allowed to compete. You can't take, and it could be written in different ways. Different courts are more or less likely to enforce them. You can't compete with our previous clients. You can't take them. You can't go into the industry for 5 years. And the broader the anti-compete clause is, the less likely it is to be enforced. But there's certainly a way that you can condition your workers that they can't compete with you. The Chassam Sofer, one of the most important rabbis of his time in the early 1800s, early 19th century, had the following case that came to him. There was an expert shochet, there was an expert butcher. And his job was he used to slaughter the meat. And a young man comes to him and he says, I would like for you to teach me how to be a shochet. I'd like for you to teach me how to slaughter animals. And the man says, sure, but I just have one concern. Right now, I'm the only shochet in town. I'm the one that everybody comes to. It wasn't like today where there was mass production of meat. You went to the store and you bought your meat. Every person had their own cows and chicken. When you were ready to eat, you'd go to the ritual slaughter and you would pay him for his services. He says, if I teach you how to do it, I'm basically building up my own competition. I don't want to compete with you. So he says, I will teach you on one condition. You agree not to compete in my area. Wherever I am the local shochet, wherever everybody comes to me, you will not compete in that area. That is my condition, and then I will teach you. And the man agreed to this. But of course, as soon as he learned, and as soon as he got his documentation that he is a kosher ritual slaughterer, the first thing he does is he sets up shop in town, and he advertises, here I am, anybody that needs to shecht, come to me. It doesn't say clearly in the response of whether he offered a better price or not, but he competes with this teacher, and the teacher turns to the Chassam Sofer. He says, I taught this man, we had this condition, and therefore I want you to tell him to enjoin him from such behavior. He should not be allowed from, give him an injunction, tell him he can't compete with me. Now, again, what's fascinating is not so much the final answer, but the analysis of the question. It is clear to the Chassam Sofer that an agreement to work or not to work, meaning on something not tangible, to tell someone you're not going to do something. So the entire contract is about something which is an idea, not something which is a physical object which is being transferred from person to person. So the Chassam Sofer says such a contract, you cannot sell such things. You can't contract such things. And therefore, from that standpoint, the entire agreement is not binding. But he did come up with a novel way to enforce the contract. And this would be very relevant in modern companies that were trying to have a halachic non-compete clause, how you could do it that would actually fit with a halachic framework. His analysis was that the non-competing is not a contract what the person will or will not do, rather it's payment for services. If I provide a service for someone, we can have a payment for that service. So the expert shochet provided a service to the apprentice. The payment for that service was your agreement not to work. And because that's the payment for the service, not because we made a contract about the future, it's a payment that you owe me for providing you with a service. So therefore he says you're not allowed to compete in that person's city, in that person's environment. Where this would be really relevant, where you start seeing how it's not so much the answer, but the analysis of the answer, which is critical. If you go to a company and you're working for them and they're not teaching you any information, you're just working, doing the job for them, from a halachic standpoint, any non-compete clause would probably be invalid, but for the fact that we have to follow the laws of the land. But from a pure Torah perspective, that contract would not be binding. But if you're apprenticing by somebody and the person is teaching you a trade, they're giving you valuable tools and information, and as a result of that, they say, I will only share these tools and ideas with you if you agree not to compete, there would be a more settled halachic claim to enforce it, because it's not a non-compete, it's a payment from the worker to the employer for the information that they gave them. So the general idea over here is, from a halachic standpoint, you cannot own intellectual property. If I develop a drug, if I write a book, if I record music, from a halachic standpoint, those are all things, as long as the other person is not physically taking my book or grabbing my CD out of the car or taking my vial of medicine, but simply replicating it on their own, I have no claim of theft. So now the question becomes, okay, what do the markets do about that? How would halacha deal with this problem? Because if there's no intellectual property, why would anybody invest time in creating a drug if anybody can copy it? You know, today you can take a drug, you can reverse engineer it, and you can create it tomorrow. So one company puts in millions and millions of dollars or billions of dollars of investment, somebody else just takes it. And is this even right? Is this a moral type of behavior? So there are some ways that halacha can enforce intellectual property, but not from an ownership standpoint. Meaning to say, we said before, hasagas gvul, there could be encroaching on a person's livelihood. They put in a big investment, and by recreating that without that investment and being able to price it even at the same cost would be predatory pricing because you don't have the investment that they have to recoup. Maybe that would be one way to enforce intellectual property. Obviously, there's the concept of dina de malchusa dina. The law of the land is the law. When we live in a foreign country, not run by Torah law, we have to accept the laws of that land to a certain degree. And if we live in the United States or in Europe or any other country in the world which has intellectual property laws, we would be obligated to follow those laws. So there would be some concept. But coming back to our original question, who owns my digital footprint? Who owns my digital persona, that image of me that is created? Who owns all of the ideas that I put onto the internet, I put onto my social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, etc.? The answer from a halachic viewpoint is nobody. So that framework of looking at the question that companies, they're taking, and this is the way many countries, for example, the European Union, they look at it, is it's I own it and other companies cannot use what I own without my consent. From a halachic, a purely Torah viewpoint, that framework doesn't work because nobody owns it. But what about my right to privacy? What about privacy? Not ownership, privacy. So there was a very famous post-millennial rabbi. When I say millennial, I don't mean the modern millennials, the ones that Dr. Abramson spoke about, that they live with the language of the iPhone. But post-millennial, right about the year 1000, and right after the year 1000. And his name was Rabbeinu Gershom. He's called the Ma'or HaGola, the luminary of the diaspora. And he created many unique laws, which we call charomim, or bans. These are bans, meaning if a person violates them, he says the person should be excommunicated. And there's a lot of discussion whether such an excommunication has force or not, but these are very well known and generally respected. Probably the most famous among them is the ban against marrying two women, against polygamy. But one of the bans that he enforced, that he writes about, and we have the exact one of the bans that he writes about, and we have the exact language of this from a later rabbi, the Maram of Rothenburg, is he writes that a person does not have the right to read someone else's correspondence. If I write something in a letter, as somebody asked me right before we started speaking today, somebody said, if I'm standing on the supermarket line and I see the person in front of me is posting something on WhatsApp or Facebook, do I have the right to look over his shoulder and to read what he's posting? Do I have the right to read somebody else's correspondence? And Rabbeinu Gershom says, absolutely not. He has one exception. Elim Kain Zorka. If the person throws the letter out, he's no longer treating it as private. At that point, someone is allowed to read it because now it's, in a certain sense, in the public domain, and we'll see the relevance of that later. As a side note, we are very familiar with the concept of confidentiality. In the last presentation, we heard about doctors and accountants, hospitals, lawyers. They have unique laws that they have to guard the confidence of their clients, of their patients. What's interesting is, from a Jewish perspective, There's no unique laws of confidentiality, not for a rabbi, not for a doctor, not for a hospital, for a lawyer. There's no unique laws of confidentiality for them. The reason for that is we are all bound by confidentiality. Talmudic law dictates that if somebody tells me something, whether I am their friend, their rabbi in confession, so to speak, their doctor, their lawyer, their spouse, if somebody tells me something, I am not allowed to repeat that without explicit permission. So there's no need to have special confidentiality for a doctor, for a rabbi, for a lawyer, because everybody should always have an expectation that all of their correspondence, all of their discussions will not be privy to the public. And imagine if we lived our lives that way, we didn't share that information, what kind of world we'd be living in. But when it comes to halacha, there's always a balancing act. So there was a rabbi in the 1600s, mid-17th century, Rabbi Yaakov Chagiz. He was born in Morocco. He ended up moving to Jerusalem. He was the chief rabbi of Jerusalem. Maybe the most famous historical part of his life is the fact that when the false Messiah Shabtai Tzvi was sweeping the world, and he came to Jerusalem expecting to be accepted by the community there as the Messiah, the Mashiach of the Jewish people, Rabbi Yaakov Chagiz is the one that stood against him and banished him from the city. And he actually wrote letters to the rabbis in Turkey where he was accepted, imploring them to reject this fraud. Unfortunately, they didn't listen. And it took Shabtai Tzvi's converting to Islam for the rabbis to finally say, okay, he's a fraud and he's not the real Messiah. So Rabbi Yaakov Chagiz, he asks an interesting question that he brings up an interesting question somebody asked him. The person says, I was entrusted to deliver a letter for somebody else from party A to party B. I am worried that in this letter, party A is telling party B to do something to harm me, to hurt me. I know I'm not allowed to read his correspondence, but if I don't and I bring it to this person, I might be causing my own harm. Am I allowed to open it up, to read the letter, to see if I have to protect myself? And what's interesting about this is that there's actually a fascinating history about exactly such a case. It's a disturbing case. It's a part of Tanakh. It's a part of our biblical literature. In the end of the second book of Shmuel, the second book of Samuel, where there's the story of David and Bathsheba, has a relationship with her. Her husband comes home from the battlefield, and David tries to get him to go home, but he refuses. And David realizes that he has a problem because Bathsheba is pregnant. What David does is he takes his most loyal servant of his, and he says, I want you to deliver, there was a war going on, which is why he said, I can't go home to be with my wife while my brothers are on the battlefield in pain. So David says, I want you to take this letter and deliver it to the general. And like the faithful servant he was, he did just that, and he never opened the letter up. And what did it say in the letter? In the letter, David was instructing his general, I want you to make sure the next time you go to battle against these Ammonites, you put him, this Uriah, at the front lines and make sure he's cannon fodder and he doesn't return home from the battlefield. Now, if Uriah would have just opened that letter up, he could have saved his life, but he didn't. So the man asked Rabbi Yaakov Chagiz, I'm worried that this letter has some harm for me. So what should I do? So he says, listen, to open it up and read it is a violation of the ban. But maybe there's some really important information and your life comes first. But you don't know that. You don't know that there's really important information there. So he says, the only solution I have for you is tear the letter up and throw it away. Mm-hmm. You didn't violate the ban. You didn't put yourself at risk. You throw the letter away and everything is fine. He then has another letter, which is maybe really illustrative for today and social media, where a person asks him about reading somebody else's correspondence. He says, I'm not going to share it with anybody. So Rabbi Yaakov Chagiz responds, he says, there's a prohibition in the Torah of tale-bearing, going around and finding out or sharing information about other people. He says, what's the difference if you share information with somebody else or you share information with yourself. When you read that letter, you're talebearing, you're taking information, private information, from other people, and you're sharing it even if you don't share it with another soul in the world. You've shared it with yourself and violated that prohibition in the Torah of tampering. So here we see that there is, from the Torah standpoint, an expectation of privacy. My correspondence, what I write, what I, and we'll speak about in a moment, what I do, I should expect that that should be private. Now, from a social media standpoint, the Aruch HaShulchan, who lives right at the turn of the century, 1900s, Michal Epstein, he had an interesting question. He says, today people write basically what's akin to a postcard. So when they send their letter out, there's almost no expectation of privacy because everybody can look at that postcard and read what it says. So he says, in my opinion, when there's no expectation of privacy, then you're allowed to read it. So maybe today when a person's posting something on social media, something is going to be, if you see someone on Facebook and they're writing it in the supermarket, but you know it's going to be public information, maybe I could look over his shoulder and read what he's writing because the person is publicizing it to the world. So what's the difference if one more person reads it? But there's one key point over here. The expectation of privacy, our right to privacy, the ownership of our information. But what about the value of privacy? What does the Torah have to teach us about the importance and the value of privacy in our life? So one of the famous verses of the Torah, we say it every day in our prayers, is Ma tovu ahlecha Yaakov mishkanosecha Yisrael. How good are your tents, Yaakov, your dwelling places, Yisrael. And the Talmud tells us, when did the prophet Bilam utter that verse? Or what caused him to utter that verse? When he looks across the camp of the Jewish people, and he notices that their tents are not facing each other, meaning he can't see inside from one house to the other. Maybe the opposite of modern condo living where you open your door and you see right into your friend's house. He says their tents were specifically created in a way, positioned in a way that each door had privacy and nobody else can see into somebody else's tent. Now, this is a pretty well-known concept. What's maybe a little less well-known is the end of what the Talmud says. The Talmud says when Bilam saw that, when Bilam saw the way the tents were situated in the desert, he says such a nation is deserving that the divine presence should rest upon them. Not just it's a nice thing to have, they are deserving that the divine presence should rest upon them. Now, why is that? What is so unique about having tents with unaligned doors that makes the Jewish people deserving of having the divine presence? And the commentaries have many, many different explanations. Some say that Bilam recognized the opposite of himself. He was a person, as the ethics of our fathers tells us, with a rapacious appetite, with an evil eye, constantly coveting what other people had. He lived his life by looking into other people's tents. What do they have? How can I get more and more? When he saw a nation living privately, each person living for themselves, not worried about what the other person has, he says, this is a whole different type of lifestyle, one he couldn't have imagined. He says, that's a divine lifestyle. Others explain that if their doors weren't facing each other, what were the doors facing? They were all facing the temple, the tabernacle, right at the center of the camp. And what that means is, instead of being concerned in our lives and our relationships, what's going on in somebody else's life, in somebody else's backyard? What are they eating for dinner? What happened with their children? How is their marriage going? They were focused on God. What was important in their life was their relationship with Hashem. That was most important. But of course, the basic concept over here, the basic concept that this verse is teaching us, that the Talmud is teaching us, how we are deserving to be a divine and godly people. It's teaching us the concept of privacy, modesty. So in the modern Jewish world, I think it's one of the most misunderstood and maligned words, modesty, tzniut, because it's used as a way to tell girls your sleeves have to be this long, you have to cover your collarbones. It's just about a manner of dress and covering yourself up so people shouldn't see you. and it becomes very confrontational. Modesty is not about the length of a dress or a sleeve or the form-fittingness of clothing. Modesty is a way of life. Modesty means living for ourselves and not for others. We don't do things to attract attention. We don't live our lives because of what someone else will say or think or tell us or think about us. We live our lives for ourselves and for, not in the selfish sense, but how to most perfect ourselves. It's not surprising that the opening of the code of Jewish law begins with the verse, with the statement, Al tisbayish mipnei hamal'igim. Do not be ashamed of the scoffers. Live your life modestly and privately, and not because of what society will say. If we're not modest, if I put my entire life into the public sphere, I never have the opportunity to develop. I never have the opportunity to become my own person. In a sense, I'm allowing the general population, I'm allowing all of my friends, my likes and dislikes, my social engagements to determine what my identity is, and I lose that sense of personal identity. That's why modesty is so key and critical from a Jewish perspective. It allows us to be us. It allows us to live our lives truthfully from the essential point of who we are and not worried about other people. And the only way that can happen is if we don't expose ourselves. We don't put ourselves as a show. Our lives are not being performed in a fishbowl or on a stage for the world to see. And that gives us the unique opportunity to become our own person. Now, there's a little more to say, maybe to discuss a little the mystical reason why Torah doesn't allow for ownership of non-tangible products. But I just want to finish with one point. Some of you might be thinking that it's a well-known Talmudic rule that we don't rule from Aggadic statements. Aggadic, or the legends of the Talmud, so to speak, generally don't have they're not halachically binding. They're nice ideas and morals, and it's a beautiful concept of privacy, but is there a halachic relevance to that? And the answer is absolutely. The Talmud says if a person has a house and their neighbor wants to build their house, and they want to open up their door opposite their neighbor's door, they're not allowed. And the Talmud asks, why are you not allowed? And it comes back to this passage of Bilam, that their doors and their tents were not aligned with each other. So it's not just a concept, but it's a halachically binding concept, which leads to the entire area of hezek riyah, damaging people by invading their privacy, and the entire Talmudic discussion about that will have to be left for another time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. I thought that was a marvelous talk, and I love the way you connected this idea of privacy. You related it to the issues we're dealing with now, but then the way you deal that with modesty and ownership, I thought it really tied it together just spot on. Proud of you. Good work. Good work. All right, so we're going to wrap up now. On let me see. Maybe the second one looks interesting. Is a business halachically responsible to repay its customers if it has a data breach?
Asking me?
Well,
okay. So the question was asked: if a business has a data breach, are they responsible to pay? So it's a complicated question, but my initial reaction would be no, they wouldn't be. And the reason for this is as follows: in general, we're not responsible for indirect damage, which is called a grumma. Something which is indirect, I didn't do directly, it's just caused by it, I wouldn't be responsible for. However, there are some exceptions. So I'll give you an example of an indirect damage, but there you actually are responsible. Maybe this would be an example of that. One example is if I take up my friend, right? My neighbor he loans somebody money, and he has a document to prove that loan, and I take that document and I tear it up. I tear up the document, so now his loan is not collectible. Did I actually take anything from him? No, I didn't take any money from him. But I caused him a big damage because now he can't collect his loan. So am I responsible? Or can I argue in court it was an indirect damage because I didn't touch his money? So the answer is, in that case, you would be responsible. And the reason you would be responsible is because in this case, there is a high expectation that behavior will lead to monetary damage. It's not just indirect. It's called garmi. It will likely lead to damage. So therefore, the person would be responsible to pay, even though the damage is indirect. So in this case, if the business had an expectation to know that this data was sensitive, and they didn't do their job in protecting it. And they knew that if by doing that, it was likely to cause damage to somebody else, then they would be responsible. If they did their due diligence, or if they didn't understand, or it was unlikely that it can cause damage, it was maybe information that they didn't realize was sensitive, they didn't know it should be sensitive, so then they'd probably be exempt from payment.
I have actually two questions, maybe. The first is posting on Facebook, which is public, is that a violation of modesty in itself? Second, that's a tough one for me. Secondly, if I put something on Facebook, we're saying I don't own it, is by posting on Facebook, do I make it hefker? Do I make it ownerless? Or do I still somehow own it?
You don't own it.
Okay.
Nobody owns it.
Right.
Do you have from a Torah standpoint, should other people be reading it if you don't want them to read it? Should other people be using it if you don't want them to use it? It's a little more complicated, meaning to say, if there's a business component, maybe. If there's no business component, probably not. But there are a lot of other areas, frameworks that we didn't even begin to discuss. For example, slander. For example, tailbearing.
Right.
So if somebody, that could be not because of you and your ownership, but they're just in violation of that law. Yeah. Now, should we be posting on Facebook? Yeah, but it depends what. Right? Modesty doesn't mean that we never walk outside of our houses. It just means we have to have a clear line. We shouldn't blur the line into which our identity just becomes public information. Our identity is our own, and then we choose carefully what to share.
Beautiful. Good answers. Thank you.
Can I ask Dr. Is that Dr. Lightstone? Is he still on?
Yeah. Dr. Lightstone.
Can I ask you a question about your talk?
Sure, go ahead.
So first of all, it was amazing and fascinating. So thank you very much. So as soon as you started speaking about the issue with the Google and the critical thinking, so immediately I thought that this was always the complaint that people had when the Rambam was written, when the Shulchan Aruch was written, and obviously we know in which direction it goes. And till not recently, when the Schottenstein Talmud was translated, they had the exact same complaints. It's going to take away from Talmud study. But as you beautifully pointed out, it was never studied like this in the past. My question is as follows. When it came historically to publishing a book, there was a very high barrier. So the books that got published and spread around, we had a pretty good degree of certainty that these were valuable books and someone reading it is getting good information. When someone is going on Google to get information, there's no barrier of entry, and people have confirmation bias, so they're looking for what will support what they wanted anyways. So how does that tie into your thinking of this issue?
Yeah, by the way, it's not only about the garbage that's on the internet, but to your point, it's also about publications. People can now self-publish on Amazon.com. So you could have a complete, a book that appears on the outside from its production qualities to be a serious book, but it's actually just not a high quality piece of literature or science or anything else. It's just one person's ramblings. So it's a huge problem that the internet is filled with garbage. Now, the way Google works today, all of Google, by the way, is fundamentally based on the original seminal idea that Larry Page had. Larry Page, one of the co-founders, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, the two co-founders of Google. And Larry Page had this idea when he was in grad school at Stanford that became known as PageRank. Before Google, there were other engines to search the internet. Right. And they tried to be very sophisticated. They would search through all the web pages, crawl the web page, figure out what the content is. And so when you asked a question, they tried to figure out how to match it with web pages that might answer your questions. Larry Page had a very clever idea. He says, no, I'm not doing that. I'm just going to see, since the internet has all these hyperlinks, you can click on a link, it takes you somewhere else. He had this clever idea. If I want to know if a page is useful, let me explore how many other pages link to it. If thousands and thousands of other pages link to National Geographic, maybe National Geographic is a worthy page, right? And that was his simple idea, which his PhD was based on, and all of Google is based on that idea of do other links point to this page or to this entity on the internet that would suggest some value. So that was a clever idea that he had. So first of all, Google itself has this notion of differentiated quality, but the quality that's looked for is essentially did someone take the time to link to something else? So it's something. There is some human discretion that has gone into it in the structure of the internet. I think that AI can be a help in the future of trying to discriminate between high quality content and low quality content. In fact, one of the things that AI is best at today is natural language understanding, and actually understand textual content. You got to remember, it's the early days for AI. All the hype, all the excitement, all the momentum in AI really started in 2012, following a seminal event at the ImageNet Challenge, which was a challenge started by Fei Li at the, I think also from actually, I forgot which university she's at, might also be Stanford. But she started this contest, this AI contest. 2012, there was this like massive breakthrough and everyone got really excited about this domain. And so everything is just like the last like 9 years. And so it's early days and it's going to get a lot more sophisticated, a lot more powerful, a lot better. And I think it will become much more discriminatory on finding real content versus garbage. But at the end of the day, there's still a lot of garbage, and AI isn't going to prevent people from posting garbage. So it's a bit of a long-winded answer to your question. I think there's some hope of things getting better. I think there's no hope of it being ultimately solved. People will continue to publish and post garbage.
Okay, I see some of the questions are coming in, were just answered. So, and we are over our time. So regretfully, I'm going to have to close the session, but it was a great session. I'm very stimulated, very excited. I want to thank Sam. I want to thank Franklin, Henry, and Dov, of course. We're really going now, and we'll be back at 7:30 this evening to look at how this affects us in terms of the real neural networkings, the ones that go on in here, how it affects our brain, how it affects us psychologically with trauma and all these kind of things from psychology point of view. And we will also be talking about how it affects our, for lack of a better word, spiritual or dream inner life. Our brain, our regular mind, our spiritual mind, all are impacted by this technology. And we're going to look at how that happens. Thank you all very much. See you in a few hours.